On a winter evening in 1908 in the prosperous West End of Glasgow, an elderly woman was found bludgeoned to death in her parlour. The victim, Marion Gilchrist, was 82 years old, wealthy and respectable, the very embodiment of Edwardian domestic security. Within days, suspicion fell not on a local thief or a resentful acquaintance, but on a foreigner, Oscar Slater, a German Jewish gambler whose flamboyant lifestyle and outsider status made him the perfect villain in the public imagination. What followed was one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in Scottish history, a trial riddled with contradictions, a conviction sustained more by prejudice than by proof, and nearly 20 years of imprisonment for a man who was innocent of the crime. At the heart of the story stands an unlikely figure. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes. Doyle was already world famous for his fictional detective, but in the Slater affair he stepped out of the realm of imagination and into reality. He took up the case with the same weapons he had given Holmes, logic, observation, and skepticism, and used them to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. With a pamphlet as sharp as any detective's monograph, he exposed the flaws in the trial, stirred public opinion, and helped secure Slater's eventual release. The case is not only about a murder, a wrongful conviction, and a writer's crusade. It is about the fragility of justice, the power of narrative, and the haunting space between fact and fiction. In the early years of the 20th century, Britain was a land torn between its Victorian past and its modernizing present. The nation prided itself on the stability of its institutions, its courts, its police, and its social hierarchies, but beneath the surface lurked prejudice, corruption, and the capricious use of power. It was against this background that one of the most remarkable true crime sagas of the age unfolded, a case that would entangle Arthur Conan Doyle, the celebrated creator of Sherlock Holmes, in a battle for justice that spanned decades. Margaret Fox's Conan Doyle for the Defence explores this extraordinary story, beginning not in the realm of fiction but in the cold streets of Glasgow, Scotland. In 1908, Glasgow, at the turn of the century, was a city of paradox. It was industrial and prosperous, its shipyards and factories producing wealth for the empire. Yet it was also scarred by poverty, overcrowded slums, and simmering ethnic tensions. Waves of immigrants, Irish, Jewish, and continental Europeans, had arrived in search of work, often facing hostility from the native Scots. The stage was thus set for suspicion and scapegoating, especially when a heinous crime shocked the city. That crime was the brutal murder of Marion Gilchrist, an elderly, wealthy woman who lived alone in the West End. On a winter evening in December 1908, she was discovered bludgeoned to death in her home, apparently during a robbery. The case caused immediate sensation. A respectable spinster, slain in her own parlour, in a supposedly genteel neighbourhood. Police hurried to find a suspect. Their investigation was hurried, flawed, and driven more by prejudice than by evidence. Within days, they fixed their attention on Oscar Slater, a foreigner of Jewish descent who lived in Glasgow. Slater was known as a gambler, a sometime pimp, and a man of dubious reputation. He was German-born, had spent time in France and America, and now lived in Scotland with his common-law wife. In short, he was the perfect scapegoat, an outsider whose very presence seemed suspicious to respectable Glaswegians. The police pursued him with single-minded zeal. They pointed to a pawn ticket for a brooch as supposed evidence linking him to the stolen items from the Gilchrist home. They made much of his decision to leave for America shortly after the murder, though he had already planned the trip. Before the crime occurred, Slater was arrested in New York and extradited to Scotland to stand trial. From the beginning, the process was stacked against him. The police had conducted a slipshod inquiry, ignoring alternative suspects and overlooking contradictory testimony. Witnesses were uncertain, identifications unreliable, and the alleged motive flimsy at best. Yet in the court of public opinion, Slater's guilt seemed a foregone conclusion. He was foreign Jewish, morally suspect, everything that could make a convenient villain for a shocked society craving quick closure. The trial took place in May 1909 and drew immense attention. The prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of neighbours who claimed to have seen a man resembling Slater near the crime scene. They pointed to his pawn ticket as proof that he had stolen jewellery from Miss Gilchrist. Yet the item in question was not hers at all. It was his own property. Despite the flimsiness of the case, the jury, swayed by prejudice and prosecutorial rhetoric, found him guilty. The judge passed a death sentence. Only at the last moment was the penalty commuted to life imprisonment at hard labour, sparing him the gallows but condemning him to spend decades in Scotland's grim Peterhead prison. Thus began a miscarriage of justice that would last nearly 20 years. Oscar Slater, who protested his innocence from the first day, became a forgotten figure in the remote prison, trapped by the machinery of a legal system unwilling to admit error. But outside the prison walls, doubts grew. Among those who heard of the case was Arthur Conan Doyle, already world famous as the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. By 1909, he was a public figure of immense stature, knighted for his patriotic writings during the Boer War, and admired for his novels, essays, and advocacy. Though best known for his fictional detective, Conan Doyle had long been fascinated by real-life cases of injustice. He believed passionately in fairness, rational inquiry, and the application of logic to legal problems. Time and again, he had intervened to challenge wrongful convictions, using his celebrity and his Holmesian reasoning to expose flaws in prosecutions. The Slater case intrigued him. To Doyle, it was a textbook example of what could go wrong when police clung to a theory and bent the facts to fit it. He studied the trial transcripts, scrutinized the evidence, and compared the reasoning of the prosecution to the standards of deduction he had honed in his stories. What he found was disturbing: contradictions, improbabilities, and a glaring lack of proof. Slater had been condemned not because of what he had done, but because of who he was. Doyle became convinced that an innocent man had been condemned and that Scotland's justice system had failed catastrophically. Fox carefully situates this episode within Doyle's larger life and times. By the early 20th century, he was both celebrated and somewhat weary. Though he had tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes in 1893, public demand had forced him to resurrect the character. Doyle longed to be recognized for more than detective stories. He wanted to be taken seriously as a historian, a social critic, even a political thinker. Cases like Slater's gave him an outlet for this ambition. They allowed him to play detective in real life, to apply the methods of Holmes in defense of actual human beings. Doyle saw himself not merely as a novelist, but as a crusader for justice. Slater, meanwhile, endured a grim existence in prison. Peterhead, located in the far northeast of Scotland, was notorious for its harsh conditions. Prisoners laboured on a massive breakwater construction project, wielding hammers and hauling stones in freezing winds. The environment was brutal, designed to break men physically and spiritually. For Slater, who maintained his innocence and chafed at his wrongful confinement, it was a daily torment. He wrote letters whenever he could, appealing to lawyers, journalists, and supporters, insisting on his innocence. His persistence kept the case alive, though years dragged on with little progress. By recounting the initial crime, the flawed investigation, and the early years of Slater's imprisonment, Fox sets the stage for the central drama, Conan Doyle's intervention and the long campaign for justice. She paints a vivid picture of the society in which these events occurred, a society obsessed with respectability, rife with prejudice, and complacent about the fallibility of its institutions. The case of Oscar Slater was not merely a local scandal. It was a mirror reflecting the biases and failures of Edwardian Britain. Doyle's eventual involvement would transform the case from a local cause célèbre into an international symbol of injustice. But before his efforts bore fruit, many years would pass, years in which Slater languished in confinement and the truth remained obscured. The opening act of the saga, then, is one of crime and punishment, but also of haste, prejudice, and the peril of convicting without proof. It is against this backdrop that Doyle would step into the role of detective, advocate, and ultimately, savior. The verdict against Oscar Slater in 1909 had the chilling finality of the law behind it, but in truth it was built on the flimsiest scaffolding of evidence. In the weeks after his conviction, a small but vocal group of legal critics and journalists expressed unease. They noted that the pawn ticket, supposedly linking Slater to a stolen brooch, was demonstrably for an item he had owned long before the murder. They pointed out that the eyewitness identifications were uncertain given under pressure and contradicted each other. They observed that Slater's hurried departure for America had been planned before Miss Gilchrist's death and could not reasonably be read as an act of flight. Yet the machinery of justice, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. For the authorities to admit doubt would have meant acknowledging grave error, something the system was loath to do. Thus Slater's sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment, not out of compassion but as a compromise to silence critics while avoiding retrial. He was dispatched to Peterhead, that bleak fortress of stone and sea, where the days were measured in grueling labour and the nights in claustrophobic silence. There, Slater would remain while outside, debate flickered on and off like a candle in the wind. The Scottish legal establishment prided itself on infallibility, and many in authority would have preferred the matter forgotten. Arthur Conan Doyle, at this time, was at the height of his public career, yet also at a crossroads personally. His fame from Sherlock Holmes was secure, but it was a mixed blessing. He had always aspired to be more than a spinner of detective yarns. He wrote histories, war accounts, and novels of chivalry, longing for recognition as a serious man of letters. At the same time, he was increasingly restless, even disillusioned, with the public's obsession with Holmes. Yet cases like Slater's drew him, for they allowed him to play the role of Holmes in reality, an avenger of injustice, a man who could cut through muddle and prejudice with the blade of reason. Doyle was no stranger to such crusades. Years earlier, he had championed George Edalji, a young Anglo-Indian solicitor, wrongly convicted of mutilating horses in Staffordshire. Doyle had dissected the evidence, exposed the inconsistencies, and forced the Home Office to reconsider. Though Edalji's full exoneration was slow in coming, Doyle's intervention had saved him from ruin and brought national attention to the perils of wrongful conviction. This experience hardened Doyle's belief that the criminal justice system was prone to error and that men of conscience had a duty to intervene. The Slater case reached Doyle's notice gradually. He read accounts, heard murmurs from legal acquaintances, and became increasingly troubled by the evident gaps in the prosecution's story. In particular, he was struck by the almost farcical reliance on the pawn ticket and the absurdity of construing Slater's scheduled voyage as proof of guilt. To Doyle, this was not detection but the parody of it. Sherlock Holmes would have scoffed at such reasoning. Still, Doyle did not leap immediately into the fray. He was cautious, aware that adopting the cause would embroil him in controversy and pit him against powerful institutions. For years, he watched from the sidelines, gathering information, considering whether his intervention could truly make a difference. Meanwhile, Slater languished in Peterhead, writing desperate appeals. His letters, preserved in archives and quoted by Fox, reveal a man both bitter and indomitable. He railed against the injustice, denounced the police for their lies, and begged for allies to take up his cause. By the mid-1910s, the case had gained a small following among reform-minded lawyers and journalists. Yet progress was glacial. Appeals were denied, petitions ignored. The war years further distracted public attention. Slater, of Jewish-German background, was doubly despised during the First World War, when anti-German sentiment ran hot. His pleas for justice met deaf ears in a Britain consumed by conflict. He became a ghost in prison, kept alive only by his own relentless insistence on innocence. For Conan Doyle, the war years were transformative. He lost his son Kingsley to illness after the Battle of the Somme, a grief that would later propel him toward spiritualism. Yet even amid personal tragedy, his sense of civic duty remained. After the war, he turned his attention once more to questions of justice and reform. The Slater case now struck him with renewed force. In 1912, he had dabbled briefly in the matter, but it was in the early 1920s that he resolved to act decisively. Doyle obtained transcripts, reviewed testimonies, and applied his characteristic method. He approached the case as Holmes might, testing each assumption, examining each witness statement for internal consistency, and reconstructing the events logically. What he found was devastating to the prosecution's case. Eyewitnesses contradicted themselves, timelines failed to align, and the supposed evidence of theft evaporated under scrutiny. Doyle concluded with growing certainty that Slater had been condemned on prejudice rather than proof. But Doyle's analysis went beyond simply identifying errors. He recognized the deeper pattern. The police, desperate for a culprit, had latched onto the most convenient outsider and then shaped the evidence to fit. This was, in essence, the very opposite of scientific detection. Holmes had often warned against the capital mistake of theorizing before one has data. Here was that mistake writ large, and a man's life had been ruined as a result. In 1927, Doyle published a powerful pamphlet titled The Case of Oscar Slater. It was both a forensic dissection of the trial and a passionate plea for justice. Doyle marshaled the facts with the clarity of a seasoned storyteller. He highlighted the absurdities, mocked the prosecution's leaps of logic, and demanded that the authorities reopen the case. The pamphlet, widely circulated, reignited public debate. Newspapers covered it, reformers rallied behind it, and once more, Slater's name was on the lips of the British public. Doyle's intervention came not a moment too soon, for Slater by then had endured nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. Age and hardship had worn him down. His health was poor, his spirit bruised, though not broken. Yet the pamphlet gave him new hope. Supporters redoubled their efforts, petitions gathered steam, and pressure mounted on the Scottish legal system. The authorities, predictably, resisted. To admit error would be to undermine public confidence in justice. Yet Doyle's stature made him impossible to ignore. He was not a fringe agitator, but a knight of the realm, beloved by millions, the man who had given Britain its greatest detective. When he spoke, people listened. Even officials who disliked his conclusions had to reckon with the weight of his reputation. Fox emphasizes that Doyle's crusade was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a moral imperative. For him, the case embodied the dangers of prejudice, the ease with which a man could be condemned for his origins rather than his deeds. It also reflected his belief in the responsibility of individuals to stand against injustice. Doyle was wealthy, famous, and secure. He had nothing to gain from helping Slater, yet he saw in the case a test of conscience, and he chose to act. By the mid-1920s, the campaign for Slater's release was gathering real momentum. Legal reformers joined Doyle in demanding a review. Newspapers published scathing editorials about the miscarriage of justice. In Scotland, the legal establishment felt the ground shifting beneath it. At last, after years of delay, the Court of Criminal Appeal agreed to hear Slater's case anew. It was a historic moment, one of the first times in Scottish history that a conviction of such vintage was reopened. The appeal hearings exposed the flimsy foundations of the original verdict. Witnesses were re-examined, contradictions laid bare, and the pawn ticket evidence shown for the farce it was. Doyle's pamphlet had prepared the public to see the absurdity of the prosecution's case, and now the court itself was forced to confront it. In 1928, after nearly 20 years, Oscar Slater's conviction was finally quashed. Slater walked free, a man aged beyond his years but vindicated at last. The victory owed much to Conan Doyle, whose persistence, clarity, and moral courage had kept the case alive when it might otherwise have been forgotten. Yet the story did not end there. Slater, though free, remained embittered. He had lost 2 decades, suffered unspeakable hardship, and been branded a criminal. He would later clash with Doyle over money and gratitude, straining their relationship. But the essential fact could not be denied. Without Doyle's intervention, Slater would likely have died in prison, another nameless victim of injustice. Fox's narrative uses this arc to illuminate not only Doyle's character, but also the broader lessons about justice. It shows how institutions can err, how prejudice can warp reason, and how individuals of conscience can make a difference. The saga is both a detective story and a moral parable, with Doyle playing the role of Holmes in Flesh and Blood. Part 2 of this saga, then, is one of awakening and intervention. From the bleak years after Slater's trial to the renewed hope of the 1920s, it traces the slow gathering of forces that would eventually break the walls of Peterhead, and at the center stands Arthur Conan Doyle, wielding reason, reputation, and righteous indignation as his weapons. The story of Oscar Slater's wrongful conviction and Arthur Conan Doyle's determination to clear his name gained intensity as the 1920s progressed. The world had changed dramatically since 1909. The Great War had shattered illusions about the stability of society and its institutions. Trust in authority was weakened, and questions about fairness and justice gained new urgency. Against this backdrop, Slater's plight, once a half-forgotten scandal, could now serve as a symbol of all that was wrong in the old system. Slater had by then spent almost 2 decades in prison, an ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance. Peterhead was notorious for its severity. Prisoners labored on the massive breakwater, their muscles aching from hauling stone in bitter cold. The cells were damp, narrow, and oppressive. Food was sparse, medical care almost non-existent. For a man who insisted upon his innocence, the psychological torment was even greater. He lived in constant anger and frustration, but also with a stubborn refusal to give in. His letters, smuggled out or sent officially, repeated the refrain, "I am innocent. The evidence against me is false. Help me to prove it." Arthur Conan Doyle's decision to intervene formally in 1927 marked the turning point. His pamphlet, The Case of Oscar Slater, was both a masterstroke of advocacy and a reflection of his genius for narrative. Written with clarity, wit, and righteous indignation, it resembled a Sherlock Holmes story in its dissection of evidence. But instead of entertaining readers with fiction, Doyle was laying bare the destruction of a real man's life by incompetence and bias. In the pamphlet, Doyle systematically dismantled the case. He began with the pawn ticket, the supposed linchpin of the prosecution. Slater had pawned a brooch days before the murder, the authorities claimed, and this linked him to stolen property from Miss Gilchrist's home. Doyle demonstrated that this brooch had nothing to do with the victim, that it was one Slater had owned for years, and that the prosecution must have known this. To present it as incriminating was either gross negligence or deliberate deceit. He then turned to the eyewitness evidence. Neighbors who claimed to have seen a man fleeing the Gilchrist residence contradicted each other about clothing, height, and build. Their identifications of Slater were uncertain, sometimes wavering, and in some cases clearly the product of suggestion by police. Doyle highlighted the absurdity of convicting a man on such flimsy and conflicting accounts. Next, he examined the supposed motive: Slater's decision to travel to America. Doyle reminded readers that the trip had been arranged well before the murder, evidenced by tickets and testimony. To interpret it as an attempt to flee justice was a gross distortion. Holmes himself, Doyle implied, would have dismissed such reasoning as the most elementary of fallacies. Finally, Doyle emphasized the broader context, the eagerness of police to find a scapegoat, the prejudices against foreigners and Jews, and the indifference of the authorities to due process. The cumulative effect of his argument was devastating. Readers could not escape the conclusion that Slater's conviction had been a miscarriage of justice of the first order. The pamphlet was widely read, reported in newspapers, and discussed in Parliament. It embarrassed the Scottish authorities, who had long hoped the case would fade into obscurity. Now it was a cause célèbre once more, and with Doyle's immense prestige behind it, it could not be ignored. Reformers seized on it as proof of the need for stronger appellate mechanisms and safeguards against wrongful conviction. Journalists published sympathetic profiles of Slater, portraying him as a tragic figure ground down by an unfeeling system. The Scottish legal establishment resisted fiercely. They feared that admitting error would not only discredit the judiciary but also open the floodgates for other appeals. Yet pressure mounted. Public opinion was shifting, and politicians were wary of being seen as defenders of injustice. At last, the authorities agreed to reopen the case through the relatively new Court of Criminal Appeal. This itself was a landmark, for Scottish law had historically been resistant to appeals, priding itself on the finality of verdicts. The appeal hearings in 1928 were dramatic. For the first time, the contradictions and weaknesses of the original trial were laid bare before a higher tribunal. Witnesses were cross-examined again. Defense lawyers, fortified by Doyle's analysis, exposed the frailty of the evidence. The pawn ticket, once so damning, collapsed as a piece of proof. The eyewitness accounts dissolved into uncertainty. The prosecution could offer no plausible explanation for why the most basic inconsistencies had been overlooked in 1909. Meanwhile, public attention was riveted. Newspapers covered each day's proceedings with relish, framing it as a long overdue reckoning. Editorials declared that if Slater was innocent, Scotland's reputation for justice was at stake. Doyle himself did not argue in court. He was not a lawyer, but his intellectual presence was felt everywhere. The defense strategy drew heavily on his pamphlet. His status as the creator of Sherlock Holmes made the metaphor irresistible. Here was Holmes himself, resurrected in Doyle's person, exposing the incompetence of real police. At length, the court delivered its verdict. Oscar Slater's conviction was quashed. After 19 years in prison, he was at last a free man. The decision electrified Britain. Crowds gathered outside the court, cheering. Newspapers hailed it as a triumph of truth over prejudice, a vindication of persistence, and a rebuke to complacent authority. For Slater, it was liberation, though tinged with bitterness at the years stolen from him. The release was not the end of the struggle. Slater returned to civilian life scarred, aged and suspicious. He was in his mid-50s with much of his prime gone. He had little money, no family nearby, and few prospects. Though exonerated, he was not compensated immediately. Only later would he receive a modest sum from the government, a gesture that hardly repaid 2 decades of unjust imprisonment. Relations between Slater and Conan Doyle grew complicated in the aftermath. At first, Slater was deeply grateful, acknowledging Doyle as his savior. But soon tensions emerged over financial matters. Slater, never shy in his demands, sought more assistance. Doyle, who had spent much of his own money campaigning for him, grew frustrated with what he perceived as ingratitude. The two men quarreled, and their friendship cooled. Doyle remained proud of his role in freeing Slater, but privately he lamented that the man he had rescued did not fit the noble image of a grateful victim. Margaret Fox highlights this irony with sensitivity. Slater was indeed no saint. He had lived a disreputable life before his arrest, earning money from gambling and shady dealings. His manners could be abrasive, his letters demanding. Yet none of this justified what had been done to him. His flaws made him all the more human, reminding readers that justice is not only for the virtuous. Doyle, accustomed to shaping characters on the page, perhaps expected Slater to behave like one of his fictional innocents, grateful, dignified, morally spotless. Reality was messier. Nevertheless, the central truth remained. Without Doyle's intervention, Slater would likely have died in prison. The case cemented Doyle's reputation as more than a storyteller. He was a man of action, a public intellectual who wielded his fame in service of justice. For the Scottish legal system, the affair was a profound embarrassment. It forced reforms, encouraged greater scrutiny of police methods, and underscored the need for appellate review. Fox situates the entire saga in the broader currents of early 20th century Britain. The decline of unquestioned authority, the rise of investigative journalism, the slow march toward legal safeguards. Doyle, with his mixture of rationalism and moral fervor, symbolized this transition. He had given the world Sherlock Holmes, the paragon of logic, but he also embodied the Victorian ideal of the gentleman crusader, using his privilege to champion the weak. By the late 1920s, Doyle himself was aging. His health declined, and his energies shifted increasingly toward spiritualism, much to the bewilderment of his admirers. Yet, in the Slater case, he had achieved something concrete and lasting. He had proved that reason, persistence, and public conscience could overcome prejudice and inertia. He had lived out, in a sense, the very detective work he had imagined in fiction. Part 3 of this account, then, is about vindication, but also about complexity. Slater was freed, yet scarred. Doyle was victorious, yet disappointed by human imperfection. The public was stirred, yet reminded of how easily justice could go astray. And the story, though nearing its climax, had still more to reveal about the uneasy relationship between truth, reputation, and the messy realities of life after injustice. The overturning of Oscar Slater's conviction in 1928 marked the dramatic high point of the saga. After nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, a man unjustly condemned had been freed, largely through the efforts of Arthur Conan Doyle and other advocates. Yet freedom did not mean deliverance from hardship. The years following Slater's release were fraught with bitterness, conflict, and disillusionment. The great detective writer had won his case, but the human aftermath proved more complicated than any story he had penned. Slater emerged from Peterhead prison a free man, but one profoundly scarred by the experience. He was no longer the relatively vigorous 36-year-old who had entered the prison gates in 1909. He was 54, prematurely aged, his health damaged by years of hard labor, poor diet, and bleak conditions. His body bore the marks of physical toil on the prison breakwater, while his spirit had hardened into suspicion and resentment. Freedom did not erase the 2 decades lost. It only emphasized the enormity of what had been taken from him. The public greeted his release with fascination. Newspapers that had once branded him guilty now carried sympathetic accounts of his ordeal. Crowds outside the courthouse cheered as he walked into the open air. For many, his exoneration was a vindication not only of Slater himself, but of the principle that justice could, at least belatedly, correct its own errors. Yet behind the celebration lay thorny questions. How could the state possibly compensate a man for 19 lost years? What would become of him now? Financial matters loomed large almost immediately. Slater had no savings, no steady occupation, and no family wealth to fall back on. The government offered him an ex gratia payment, $6,000 in compensation, a significant sum but hardly adequate to balance 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment. To a man embittered by his treatment, the payment seemed paltry. He accepted it, but it did little to soothe his sense of grievance. At first, Slater expressed deep gratitude to Conan Doyle, publicly acknowledging his debt. Without Doyle's intervention, he told reporters, he would never have won release. Yet the relationship soon soured. Slater expected ongoing financial and personal support. He wrote to Doyle asking for assistance, sometimes in tones that seemed demanding rather than thankful. Doyle, who had already invested considerable time, money, and energy into the case, grew exasperated. He had expected Slater to show dignified gratitude, perhaps to retreat quietly into a modest but honorable life. Instead, he found himself confronted by a man whose bitterness overflowed into every interaction. The clash revealed the difference between Doyle's idealized view of justice and the messy realities of human behavior. Doyle, ever the Victorian moralist, believed that righteousness should inspire noble conduct. Slater, however, was not a literary character but a flawed human being, combative, restless, and impatient. He had lived on society's margins even before his arrest, earning money from gambling and dubious enterprises. Prison had not refined him, it had made him harder. The disconnect between Doyle's expectations and Slater's reality strained their bond until it nearly collapsed. Slater's post-prison years were also marked by legal disputes of a different sort. He attempted to press for greater compensation, arguing that the sum awarded was insufficient. He engaged in civil actions, wrote angry letters to officials, and sought to capitalize on the notoriety of his case. Yet public sympathy, so strong at the moment of his release, gradually waned. People admired the principle of his exoneration, but grew weary of his constant demands. In time, he faded from the headlines. Conan Doyle, meanwhile, was in his twilight years. The Slater case had been one of his last great public crusades. He had poured into it the energy of his belief in logic, fairness, and the responsibility of the privileged to defend the vulnerable. Yet his own health was failing, and his interests were shifting ever more toward spiritualism. In 1930, just 2 years after Slater's release, Doyle died at the age of 71. The champion of Sherlock Holmes and the defender of Oscar Slater was gone, leaving behind a legacy both literary and moral. Fox underscores the poignancy of this timing. Doyle did not live long enough to see how Slater's life played out in the longer term, nor did he see how posterity would judge his intervention. In his own time, he was celebrated for it. Newspapers lauded him as a man who had turned fiction into reality, deploying Holmes's deductive methods in service of truth. Yet in private, Doyle had known disappointment. He had hoped not only to free Slater, but to elevate him, to demonstrate that justice could restore dignity as well as liberty. Slater's prickly behavior after release confounded this hope. Still, the larger impact of the case transcended these personal frictions. The quashing of Slater's conviction helped spur discussions about reforming the Scottish criminal justice system. It highlighted the dangers of over-reliance on circumstantial evidence, the fallibility of eyewitness identification, and the corrosive effect of prejudice. It demonstrated the need for appellate review, a safeguard that Scotland had historically resisted. Above all, it exposed how institutions could entrench error to protect their own authority, and how only sustained outside pressure could break through. For the public, the story also reinforced the enduring appeal of the detective archetype. Doyle's involvement blurred the boundary between fiction and reality. Readers could not help but see Sherlock Holmes's hand in the analysis of the Slater case. Newspapers and commentators drew the comparison constantly, framing the story as Holmes vindicating truth where Scotland Yard had failed. Doyle himself cultivated this connection, writing with the clarity and narrative force of a detective yarn. The case thus became part of the Holmesian mythos, a real-life adventure in which reason triumphed over folly. Slater's later years passed in relative obscurity. He lived quietly in Ayr, a coastal town in Scotland, sometimes working odd jobs, sometimes relying on his compensation money. He married late in life and enjoyed a measure of domestic stability, though always shadowed by his past. He died in 1948 at the age of 77. His name had faded from public memory, remembered mainly by legal scholars and Doyle enthusiasts. Yet for those who studied the case, it remained a touchstone, a reminder of the fragility of justice and the power of individual conscience. Fox closes this portion of her narrative by reflecting on the dual legacy of the saga. For Slater, it was a tragedy partially redeemed. He regained his freedom, but never the years stolen. For Conan Doyle, it was a triumph tempered by disappointment, a victory of principle, but a reminder of human imperfection. For Britain, it was a lesson in humility, a demonstration that even the most venerable institutions could err disastrously. Part 4 of the saga, then, is about aftermath, about the messy business of living after injustice, the difficulty of reconciling ideals with reality, and the enduring tension between gratitude and grievance. It reveals that while fiction may provide neat resolutions, real life rarely does. Doyle, the master of narrative closure, discovered this truth in the most personal way. He had freed his client, but he could not script the rest of the story. The Slater affair, though resolved in the courtroom, continued to reverberate in the wider culture of Britain. Its significance went beyond the fate of one man or the reputation of Arthur Conan Doyle. It illuminated systemic flaws in Scottish justice, revealed the enduring danger of prejudice, and demonstrated the power of public opinion when galvanized by a figure of Doyle's stature. In Part 5 of the saga, Margaret Fox broadens her scope, showing how the case reshaped perceptions of law, detection, and the responsibilities of the intelligentsia. The most immediate impact was on the Scottish legal system itself. Historically, Scotland had prided itself on the finality of jury verdicts. Appeals were rare, and there was little appetite for revisiting settled convictions. The Slater case made a mockery of such pride. Here was a man condemned largely on supposition, whose innocence had become almost self-evident once the evidence was examined rationally. The Court of Criminal Appeal, still relatively new, had been forced to acknowledge what ordinary citizens could already see, that Slater should never have been convicted. The embarrassment of this reversal spurred renewed debate about safeguards, the reliability of identification evidence, and the need for more rigorous appellate procedures. Reformers pointed out that if not for Slater's dogged persistence and Doyle's intervention, the miscarriage might never have been corrected. How many other innocent men, less fortunate in their advocates, had been left to rot in prison, or hanged at the gallows? The case thus became an exemplar in arguments for modernizing the justice system, reinforcing the principle that law must admit the possibility of error. For many, it underscored the need to see justice not as an infallible monolith, but as a human institution requiring constant scrutiny. The case also revealed the role of prejudice in distorting justice. Slater's Jewish heritage, his foreignness, and his marginal lifestyle had marked him as guilty in the eyes of respectable society long before the trial began. The prosecution and the press played upon these perceptions, portraying him as a sinister outsider. Fox shows how anti-Semitic tropes, familiar across Europe in the early 20th century, helped make Slater's conviction palatable. His actual character flaws, gambling, womanizing, arrogance, were magnified into proof of criminality. In this sense, the trial was less about evidence than about identity. Doyle's intervention challenged this narrative. He insisted that guilt or innocence must rest on facts, not on prejudice. By dissecting the evidence, he showed how easy it was for bias to masquerade as proof. His pamphlet appealed not just to reason, but to fairness, demanding that Slater be judged by the same standard as any respectable citizen. In doing so, Doyle implicitly critiqued the broader culture of scapegoating and xenophobia. Though he did not frame it in modern terms, his campaign was an early example of resisting systemic prejudice within the law. Beyond the legal implications, the case also reshaped the image of Conan Doyle himself. To the public, he was more than ever identified with Sherlock Holmes, and the Slater affair only deepened this association. Journalists delighted in drawing parallels. Holmes the detective had leapt from the page, incarnated in his creator, to solve a real mystery and expose official folly. Doyle himself half embraced, half resisted this role. On the one hand, he prided himself on his rational method, which indeed resembled Holmes's deductive approach. On the other, he chafed at being seen merely as Holmes's mouthpiece, He wanted recognition as a serious man of letters and a moral actor, not merely as a spinner of tales. Still, the comparison was irresistible. The public saw Doyle as having enacted the very drama he had imagined, a brilliant detective overturning the errors of the police. This blurred boundary between fiction and reality enhanced the cultural status of detective fiction itself. It suggested that the genre was not merely entertainment but a training ground for rational thought, a way of educating the public in skepticism and logic. Fox emphasizes how the Slater case fed into the growing prestige of detective literature in the interwar period, preparing the ground for the so-called golden age of crime fiction. For Doyle personally, the case reaffirmed his sense of moral duty. He believed that individuals of wealth and influence had a responsibility to use their resources in service of the greater good. To him, freeing Slater was not merely an intellectual puzzle, but an ethical obligation. He could not stand by while an innocent man languished. This ethos of noblesse oblige, inherited from his Victorian upbringing, animated many of his causes, whether fighting for military reforms, advocating for legal appeals, or even, later, promoting spiritualism as a form of consolation for the grieving. Yet the Slater case also revealed the limits of this ethos. Doyle had hoped that freeing Slater would not only restore liberty, but also vindicate the principle that justice, once set right, ennobles all involved. He expected gratitude, dignity, perhaps even moral transformation. Instead, he encountered Slater's bitterness and demands. This disillusionment forced Doyle to confront the gap between idealism and reality. He could free the man, but he could not script his behavior. He could prove a miscarriage, but he could not repair a life. Justice, in practice, was messier than in fiction. The broader cultural resonance of the case was profound. It became a touchstone in debates about the fallibility of evidence, cited in discussions of wrongful convictions well into the 20th century. Legal scholars dissected it as an example of confirmation bias. Once police had fixed upon Slater, they interpreted every fact through the lens of his presumed guilt, ignoring contradictions. In modern terms, it illustrated the dangers of tunnel vision in investigation and the need for safeguards against cognitive error. Fox also places the case in the wider historical context of European anti-Semitism. Though Britain lacked the violent pogroms of Eastern Europe, prejudice was nonetheless entrenched. The Dreyfus affair in France had erupted only a decade earlier, when another Jewish outsider was condemned on fabricated evidence. Slater's ordeal was a Scottish echo of that scandal, demonstrating how easily prejudice could lead to injustice even in supposedly enlightened societies. Doyle, in championing Slater, implicitly aligned himself with those who resisted this, tied though he never cast the struggle in explicitly political terms. The media played a crucial role as well. The same press that had vilified Slater in 1909 later celebrated his exoneration in 1928. Newspapers both reflected and shaped public opinion, demonstrating the power of journalism in matters of justice. Doyle's own pamphlet, crafted in a style accessible to ordinary readers, harnessed this power deliberately. He understood the value of narrative, how to frame facts in a way that captured imagination and provoked outrage. In this sense, his skills as a writer were instrumental to his success as an advocate. By the time Slater walked free, Doyle was nearing the end of his life. He would die only 2 years later in 1930. For him, the Slater case was a final vindication of the values he had championed throughout his career: reason, fairness, and the duty of the privileged to defend the powerless. It was also, paradoxically, a reminder of his limitations. He could correct a verdict, but he could not erase prejudice or restore lost years. He could win a legal battle, but not heal the scars of injustice. Nevertheless, the case secured his place in history not only as a literary genius but as a real-life crusader. Later generations of legal reformers, detectives, and writers would look back to Doyle's campaign as a model of how intellect and conscience could combine to right a wrong. The very idea of wrongful conviction, now a staple concern of criminal justice reform, gained credibility in part because of high-profile cases like Slater's. Thus, Part 5 of the saga is about resonance, how a single miscarriage of justice, once exposed, reverberated through law, culture, and literature. It shows how Doyle's intervention transcended the particulars of one man's life, becoming, instead, a symbol of reason confronting prejudice, of fiction reinforcing reality, of conscience challenging authority. It demonstrates that while human behavior may disappoint, principles endure. And it sets the stage for the final reflections on what this extraordinary story tells us about the intersection of truth, justice, and the power of narrative. The tale of Conan Doyle for the defense closes not with a tidy ending, but with the sober acknowledgement that justice, once distorted, can never be fully restored. Oscar Slater's freedom, though triumphantly won, could not erase the long years stolen from him. Arthur Conan Doyle's intervention, though heroic, was not sufficient to repair the human damage. And yet the story remains profoundly significant, both as a testament to the power of reason and as a warning of the frailty of institutions. Slater's later years unfolded quietly compared to the sensational drama of his conviction and release. After receiving $6,000 in compensation, he settled in Ayr on the west coast of Scotland. He married a younger woman, resuming some semblance of ordinary domestic life. Yet he never escaped the shadow of his ordeal. Neighbours regarded him with curiosity. To some he was a martyr to injustice, to others still a suspicious outsider. Though legally vindicated, he bore the stigma of notoriety. He remained combative, sometimes cantankerous, frequently at odds with acquaintances. Prison had not softened him. It had left him wary, mistrustful, and perpetually on guard. For Slater, the compensation money was both a lifeline and a source of further bitterness. He believed the sum inadequate for nearly 20 years of wrongful imprisonment. He pressed for more, wrote angry letters, and occasionally made headlines with new demands. But the public, having celebrated his release, soon lost patience with his continued grievances. Sympathy waned, leaving him increasingly isolated. He died in 1948 at the age of 77, remembered dimly, if at all, by a new generation. Arthur Conan Doyle, by contrast, did not live to see most of this aftermath. He died in 1930, 2 years after Slater's release. For Doyle, the case had been one of his last great causes. It epitomized his lifelong devotion to rational inquiry and moral responsibility. He had often insisted that the methods of Sherlock Holmes were not mere fiction, but could serve as a model for real-world reasoning. In the Slater affair, he had demonstrated this truth conclusively. By applying logic, skepticism, and fairness, he had achieved what police and prosecutors had failed to do, to discern the difference between suspicion and fact. Yet Doyle's legacy was also complicated. His later life was increasingly dominated by spiritualism, a belief that puzzled and even embarrassed many of his admirers. To some, his embrace of seances and mediums seemed at odds with the rationalism of Sherlock Holmes. Yet in his defense of Slater, Doyle showed that his commitment to logic and justice remained intact. If anything, the two impulses, the rational and the spiritual, coexisted uneasily within him, reflecting his era's struggle between science and faith. Margaret Fox ends her account by emphasizing the enduring lessons of the case. The Slater affair was not merely a curiosity of legal history, but a parable about human error. It demonstrated how institutions can become blind when driven by prejudice or the desire for closure. The police, fixated on Slater from the outset, ignored contrary evidence. The prosecution presented flimsy arguments with unwarranted confidence. The jury, swayed by xenophobia and assumption, delivered a verdict unsupported by proof. The judiciary, loath to admit error, resisted appeal after appeal. Only the sustained intervention of outsiders broke through the wall of denial. The case thus illustrates the concept of confirmation bias long before psychologists gave it a name. Once convinced of Slater's guilt, the authorities interpreted every fact as supporting that conclusion, dismissing or overlooking all inconsistencies. Doyle, by contrast, embodied the antidote. An open-minded examination of evidence, guided by logic rather than prejudice. His success was not due to supernatural intuition or genius, but to clear-headed reasoning and moral conviction. The broader cultural resonance of the case endures as well. It reinforced the idea that detective fiction and real-world justice are not wholly separate. The methods of Holmes, the insistence on facts, the avoidance of premature theorizing, the skepticism of appearances, proved valuable in actual legal struggles. The public's delight in the Holmesian parallels underscored a deeper truth, that stories can shape how people understand reality. Doyle's fiction had prepared readers to value rationality, and his real-life advocacy showed those values at work. For legal historians, the Slater case remains a milestone in the development of appellate review in Scotland. It demonstrated the dangers of finality without oversight. It also highlighted the necessity of transparency in criminal proceedings. Modern discussions of wrongful convictions, DNA exonerations, miscarriages of justice revealed decades later echo themes already present in the Slater affair. The case foreshadowed a century of struggle to reconcile justice with fallibility. For readers of Doyle, the story adds a poignant dimension to his legacy. It shows that he was not content to be merely a novelist. He was a man of conscience, willing to expend his prestige, wealth, and energy on behalf of a stranger. His disappointment with Slater's lack of gratitude may have soured his personal feelings, but it did not diminish the moral significance of his act. He had proved that fiction's ideals could inspire real action, that stories could indeed change lives. Fox's narrative closes by returning to the image of Holmes, the eternal detective. Though fictional, Holmes embodied values of clarity, logic, and fairness that transcended the page. Doyle, in defending Slater, enacted those values in the real world. It was as if Holmes himself had stepped into history, not through the fog of Baker Street, but through the pen of his creator. The case stands as a rare moment when literature and life converged, when a writer's imagination armed him to confront injustice. The lesson of Conan Doyle for the defense is ultimately sobering. Justice is fragile, and once corrupted, it can destroy lives beyond repair. Prejudice, haste, and institutional pride are constant dangers, yet the story also offers hope that individuals armed with reason and moral courage can make a difference. Doyle could not restore the years taken from Slater, but he could free him from the injustice that still shackled him. His intervention reminds us that vigilance is the price of fairness, and that the responsibility to defend the innocent belongs not only to institutions, but to every person of conscience. Thus, Part 6 of the saga concludes the narrative not with triumph alone, but with reflection. It is a story of victory tempered by loss, of ideals colliding with reality, of literature's power to inspire action. Oscar Slater's life was irreparably scarred, but his case reshaped law and revealed truth. Arthur Conan Doyle's fame rests on Sherlock Holmes, but his nobility shines also in this crusade. Together they form an unlikely pair, one a wronged outsider, the other a knighted author, forever linked in the annals of justice. Though the immediate drama of the Slater case reached its conclusion with his release in 1928 and Doyle's death in 1930, the broader world in which this saga unfolded deserves closer attention. To understand its full meaning, one must situate the story within the social, cultural, and political climate of Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Only then does the true resonance of the affair become clear. Britain at the dawn of the 20th century was both self-assured and deeply anxious. The empire stretched across the globe, yet at home, industrial cities struggled with overcrowding, poverty, and social unrest. Glasgow, where Marion Gilchrist was murdered, epitomized these contradictions. It was a powerhouse of shipbuilding and heavy industry, celebrated as the second city of the empire, but also infamous for its slums, sectarian violence, and simmering ethnic tensions. In such an environment, respectability and order mattered intensely to the middle classes, who feared the turbulence lurking beneath their fragile security. The murder of Gilchrist struck at these anxieties. An elderly, genteel woman slain in her own flat seemed to symbolize the vulnerability of respectability itself. The demand for swift justice was overwhelming, and police responded by seizing upon the most obvious outsider. Oscar Slater, with his foreign accent, dubious livelihood, and Jewish background, was tailor-made for suspicion. Fox underscores how quickly narrative filled the void left by scant evidence. To many Glaswegians, Slater's guilt was obvious before any trial began, for he represented their unease about immigration, morality, and disorder. This reflex of scapegoating reflected deeper European currents. The Dreyfus affair in France during the 1890s had shown how anti-Semitism could warp justice on a grand scale, dividing a nation and exposing its institutions' corruption. Though Britain lacked the ferocity of French anti-Semitism, the same prejudices simmered. Jews were often portrayed as alien, manipulative, or criminal. For a working-class Jew like Slater, lacking the polish of assimilation, such stereotypes could prove deadly. His gambling and associations with prostitutes confirmed the worst suspicions of the respectable classes. To them, he was not an individual with rights, but a symbol of corruption. Arthur Conan Doyle's role in this context was remarkable precisely because he stood against the grain. He was no radical. He was a knight, a patriot, and a man of the establishment. Yet his conscience compelled him to see through the prejudice. Doyle's logic cut through the assumptions that had condemned Slater. Where others saw a sinister foreigner, he insisted on evaluating facts. His intervention thus carried special weight. It was not the protest of a marginalized agitator, but the voice of a respected insider turning against his own class's prejudices. Doyle's ability to persuade stemmed from his command of narrative. He understood that human beings respond not only to facts, but to stories. In his pamphlet, he did not merely list contradictions. He crafted a tale in which Slater was the wronged innocent and the police the misguided villains. He used irony, rhetorical questions, and Holmesian wit to make his case compelling. In doing so, he transformed a dry legal controversy into a moral drama that readers could grasp and remember. It is instructive to compare Doyle's approach to that of his contemporaries in journalism. Reporters often sensationalized, reducing complex realities to melodrama. Doyle, too, relied on drama, but his purpose was truth. He dramatized the flaws of the prosecution, not to entertain, but to awaken outrage. His narrative strategy demonstrates the ethical use of storytelling, where style serves justice rather than distorts it. Slater himself, meanwhile, complicates the parable. He was no saintly victim in the mold of Dickens's innocence. His past included gambling, shady dealings, and associations that made him unpopular. This made him an imperfect vessel for a cause célèbre. Doyle's disillusionment after Slater's release stemmed partly from this mismatch. He had hoped to present a story of noble victimhood, but reality offered instead a flawed, abrasive man. Yet this is precisely the point. Justice must apply equally to the flawed and the virtuous. To demand sainthood as a prerequisite for fairness is to abandon the very principle of impartiality. Slater's imperfections make the case more, not less, significant. The legacy of the affair continued in British cultural life. It reinforced skepticism toward police authority, a theme that resonated with interwar anxieties. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of social upheaval, labor strikes, political radicalism, and debates about the power of the state. The idea that the justice system could err, that institutions could imprison the innocent, fit uneasily but productively into this climate. It encouraged citizens to view authority not as unassailable, but as accountable. In literature, the case bolstered the prestige of detective fiction. Doyle had long argued that Holmes's methods of logic and observation were applicable to real life. With Slater's exoneration, this claim seemed vindicated. The public delighted in the parallel. Fiction had proved useful in reality. This helped pave the way for the so-called golden age of detective fiction in the 1920s and 1930s, with writers like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. These authors inherited not only Holmes's mantle, but also the cultural credibility enhanced by Doyle's real-world crusade. In law, the case highlighted the dangers of eyewitness identification, a lesson still relevant today. Psychologists later confirmed what the Slater case already showed. Memory is fallible, suggestible, and easily manipulated. Witnesses who were uncertain became certain under police pressure. Contradictions were smoothed over, doubts erased. Slater's wrongful conviction was built largely on this fragile foundation. Modern reforms in line-up procedures, cautionary jury instructions, and appellate scrutiny owe something to the cautionary tale of Slater. Fox also emphasizes the personal dimension, what the case reveals about Conan Doyle as a man. He was in many respects contradictory. He could be credulous in his spiritualist beliefs, yet devastatingly rational in legal analysis. He sought fame, yet yearned for serious recognition. He created Holmes, the apostle of reason, yet himself embraced the supernatural. The Slater case shows Doyle at his best, lucid, principled, courageous. It reminds us that human beings are rarely consistent, yet their contradictions need not cancel their greatness. Even Slater's later ingratitude toward Doyle, painful though it was, underscores the complexity of justice. Doyle may have wanted a narrative of redemption, but real life offered a man too wounded and embittered to play that role. That he failed to be the perfect victim does not diminish the injustice he suffered, nor the nobility of Doyle's fight. Instead, it reveals the limits of what justice can achieve. Exoneration can restore liberty, but not innocence in the eyes of all, nor the lost years, nor the psychological scars. In reflecting on these realities, Conan Doyle for the defense becomes more than a story of crime and exoneration. It becomes a meditation on human fallibility, on how easily we are swayed by prejudice, how resistant institutions are to admitting error, and how fragile truth can be in the face of narrative. Yet it also affirms the possibility of conscience, courage, and reason. It shows that individuals can challenge the weight of the state, that truth can be recovered even after long delay, and that literature itself can shape the pursuit of justice. The Slater affair is thus both cautionary and inspiring. It warns us never to assume that guilt is obvious, never to trust too readily in the machinery of justice, and never to forget the human cost of error. At the same time, it encourages us to believe that one voice, if clear and persistent enough, can make a difference. Doyle's pamphlet was small in size but enormous in impact. It stands as proof that intellect and conscience, when combined, can pierce the fog of prejudice. The Slater affair, though singular in its details, resonates because it embodies universal themes: prejudice, fallibility, resistance, and redemption. To deepen our understanding, one must look not only at the sequence of events but also at the character of the two central figures, Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Slater, and how their lives, so different in origin and temperament, collided in a way that altered both men and left a mark on history. Arthur Conan Doyle was, by the 1920s, a man of contradictions. Born in Edinburgh in 1859, he trained as a physician before turning to writing. His creation of Sherlock Holmes brought him fame beyond imagining, but also frustration. Holmes overshadowed his other literary ambitions. Doyle wanted to be remembered as a serious historian, a novelist of adventure, a thinker with weighty views on politics and society. Yet the public clamoured for Holmes, and publishers demanded more tales of the detective with the violin and the magnifying glass. Doyle's personality combined rational discipline with romantic idealism. He valued logic, as his detective stories showed, but he also believed in honor, duty, and the moral responsibilities of the upper classes. This sense of noblesse oblige, of the wealthy and educated bearing responsibility for the weak, animated much of his public life. He wrote patriotic propaganda during the Boer War, defended causes he believed righteous, and never hesitated to speak out against what he saw as injustice. By the time of the Slater case, Doyle was already an experienced campaigner for the wrongfully convicted. The Adalji case in 1907 had taught him both the potential and the limits of intervention. He had learned how authorities resisted admitting error, how entrenched prejudice could distort justice, and how public opinion could be mobilized by clear narrative. These lessons he carried into his defense of Slater. His analysis of the Slater trial bore all the marks of Holmesian method: skepticism of assumptions, attention to detail, logical reconstruction of events. Yet it also bore the moral indignation of a man who believed that justice was a sacred trust. Doyle's credibility was crucial. As a knight of the realm, a man of letters and a national celebrity, he was hard to dismiss as a crank. His voice carried weight in Parliament and the press. His pamphlet was not merely another protest, but a pronouncement from one of Britain's most famous citizens. In an age when celebrity could sway public affairs, Doyle used his fame for justice. If Doyle was the embodiment of respectability, Slater was its opposite. Born in Germany in 1872 as Oscar Slater, he drifted through Europe and America before settling in Glasgow. He changed his name, lived with a woman out of wedlock, and earned money through gambling and, allegedly, pimping. He dressed flamboyantly, carried himself with bravado, and attracted suspicion wherever he went. To respectable Glaswegians, he epitomized the foreign underworld intruding into their city. Slater's lifestyle made him vulnerable. When Gilchrist was murdered, police needed a culprit who looked the part of a criminal. Slater, with his reputation and recent departure for America, was convenient. That the evidence was flimsy mattered little. His persona filled the gap. During his trial, the prosecution painted him as a man of vice, and the jury found it easy to believe that such a figure could commit murder. His conviction was as much a judgment on his character as on the supposed facts. In prison, Slater's resilience was remarkable. He endured brutal conditions but never ceased protesting his innocence. His letters, though often bitter, reveal intelligence and determination. He reached out to allies, crafted arguments, and kept his case alive. His personality, abrasive and insistent, may have alienated some, but it also ensured that his plight was never entirely forgotten. After release, his flaws resurfaced. He quarreled with supporters, demanded more compensation, and seemed incapable of the humble gratitude Doyle had imagined. Yet to reduce him to ingratitude would be unfair. He had suffered enormously. His suspicion, his restlessness, his inability to let grievances go, these were natural consequences of nearly 2 decades stolen. Slater was not the saintly victim some reformers might have wished for, but his humanity was real, messy, and instructive. Collision of two worlds. The meeting of Doyle and Slater was improbable, the knighted gentleman author and the German Jewish gambler. Yet their fates intertwined because of the murder of Marion Gilchrist and the miscarriage of justice that followed. Doyle brought reason, moral authority, and narrative skill. Slater brought desperation, persistence, and the raw fact of his suffering. Together they forced a reckoning with Scotland's legal system. Their relationship, however, was fraught. Doyle wanted Slater to fit into a moral story, the wronged innocent saved by the noble defender. Slater, scarred by prison, refused to play the role. He demanded, he complained, he failed to show the docility Doyle expected. Their falling out reveals the tension between ideals and reality. Doyle could control his stories, but not the behavior of the real people within them. Slater remained himself, complex, abrasive, and unbowed. The Slater case is often compared with the Dreyfus affair in France, and the parallels are striking. Both involved Jewish outsiders condemned on weak evidence, both revealed institutional prejudice, and both required the intervention of prominent intellectuals to expose the miscarriage. Just as Émile Zola's famous J'accuse galvanized French opinion, Doyle's pamphlet stirred Britain. Both cases forced nations to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and justice. Yet there were differences. The Dreyfus affair tore France apart, dividing society into camps for and against. The Slater case, while embarrassing to Scottish justice, did not reach the same pitch of national crisis. Partly, this was because Slater was less sympathetic than Dreyfus, who was an army officer and patriot. Slater was a gambler of dubious repute. But that difference makes Doyle's intervention all the more striking. He defended not a paragon, but a flawed man, insisting that justice must not discriminate between saints and sinners. The Slater case anticipated modern concerns about wrongful conviction. Today, with DNA evidence exonerating prisoners decades after their trials, society is acutely aware of how easily justice can err. The themes are the same: tunnel vision by investigators, unreliable eyewitnesses, prosecutorial zeal, judicial reluctance to admit error. Slater's case foreshadowed these patterns. Doyle's pamphlet reads, in modern terms, like an early Innocence Project brief. The lesson endures: justice must be constantly scrutinized, for error is inevitable. Doyle's insistence on skepticism, on testing every assumption, remains relevant in an age when forensic science has advanced, but human bias still distorts outcomes. Slater's story reminds us that behind every case number is a human life, capable of being destroyed by prejudice and haste. Thus, Part 8 deepens the saga by exploring the characters of Doyle and Slater, the collision of their worlds, the comparison with the Dreyfus affair, and the legacy for modern justice. It shows that the case is not merely history, but a mirror in which we see enduring truths. That reason must always confront prejudice, that justice must serve the flawed as well as the virtuous, and that literature itself can shape how society understands truth. By the time Oscar Slater was freed and Arthur Conan Doyle had passed away, the case had already taken on a life of its own in the cultural imagination. It was more than a sensational crime story or even a single miscarriage of justice. It had become a parable of truth versus prejudice, of rational inquiry against institutional complacency, of the outsider wronged and the insider who risked reputation to save him. In Part 9, we turn to the broader cultural reception of the Slater affair, how it was recorded in newspapers, how it influenced literature, and how it became part of the ongoing dialogue about law and fairness. From the beginning, the press played a decisive role. In 1908-1909, Glasgow's newspapers sensationalized the Gilchrist murder, feeding readers' appetite for drama and fear. The image of a defenseless spinster bludgeoned in her flat created a narrative that demanded resolution. Reporters amplified police suspicions about Slater, painting him as a menacing foreigner, his gambling and relationships paraded as proof of villainy. Trial coverage reinforced this narrative, encouraging readers to see guilt as obvious. But nearly 2 decades later, when Doyle's pamphlet revived the case, the press underwent a transformation. Newspapers now framed Slater as a victim, a man unjustly crushed by the system. Headlines praised Doyle's intervention, casting him in heroic light. Stories emphasized the frailty of the evidence, the contradictions in testimony, and the cruelty of long imprisonment. Public opinion, once so ready to condemn, now swung to sympathy. This reversal demonstrates the malleability of collective perception, how quickly society can reframe a story when a new narrative voice seizes attention. Doyle understood this dynamic intimately. He was, after all, a master of narrative. His pamphlet was not merely a legal argument, but a piece of storytelling designed for the press. He anticipated the needs of journalists: clarity, drama, quotability. His writing provided ready-made lines that could be lifted into headlines. He framed the story in moral terms that transcended technicalities. By doing so, he controlled the narrative arc, guiding public opinion toward outrage and sympathy. The Slater case also fed back into literature, particularly the genre of detective fiction. Conan Doyle's role blurred the line between author and detective, fiction and reality. The public adored the notion that Sherlock Holmes's creator had himself solved a mystery using the very methods he had made famous. This reinforced the cultural status of the detective archetype, the rational hero who exposes truth against the blunders of officialdom. In the 1920s and 1930s now, detective fiction was entering its golden age. Writers like Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Freeman Wills Crofts crafted intricate puzzles that enthralled readers. These stories often centered on the principle that careful observation and logical deduction could overcome deception. The Slater affair gave this idea a real-world anchor. It proved that the detective's ethos was not mere fantasy, but a necessary corrective to institutional error. Readers who consumed detective novels with delight could point to Slater as proof that such skills mattered in reality. Fox makes clear that Doyle's public defense of Slater elevated detective fiction's cultural cachet. It demonstrated that literature could illuminate real problems, that storytelling could save lives. The Holmes stories had popularized a method of thinking. Doyle's intervention showed its utility. This helped solidify detective fiction as a genre with intellectual seriousness, not just entertainment. Philosophy of justice in Doyle's worldview, Arthur Conan. Doyle's involvement in the Slater affair was not accidental, but stemmed from his worldview. He believed deeply in the moral duty of the privileged to defend the weak. He was in many respects a Victorian paternalist, but his paternalism was rooted in a genuine sense of responsibility. Justice, to him, was not abstract but practical. It meant using reason to ensure fairness for every individual, no matter how lowly. At the same time, Doyle was acutely aware of human fallibility. His Holmes stories often warned against the capital mistake of theorizing before one has data. The Slater case exemplified this error. Police had seized upon a theory, Slater's guilt, and then bent every fact to fit. To Doyle, this was precisely the opposite of science. True reasoning required impartiality, skepticism, and patience. His pamphlet was, in effect, Holmes's method applied to life. Yet Doyle was also a man of his time, and his view of justice was entwined with ideals of honor and manliness. He admired Slater's persistence, though he bristled at his abrasiveness. He expected a kind of dignified gratitude from the freedman, and when this was not forthcoming, Doyle was disappointed. This reveals the limits of Doyle's philosophy. He could fight for justice in principle, but struggled to reconcile it with the messy reality of flawed human character. Legally, the Slater case underscored the need for appellate safeguards. Before the early 20th century, Scotland lacked a robust appeal mechanism. Verdicts were considered final, and only extraordinary circumstances could reopen a case. The Slater affair demonstrated the danger of such rigidity. Without the Court of Criminal Appeal, and without Doyle's pressure to use it, Slater would have remained imprisoned until death. The case also illustrated the perils of eyewitness identification. Modern psychology has confirmed that memory is malleable, susceptible to suggestion, and often unreliable. In Slater's trial, witnesses contradicted themselves, changed descriptions, and yet were treated as decisive. The appeal process revealed how shaky this evidence truly was. Today, legal scholars cite Slater's conviction as an early example of the dangers of relying on eyewitness testimony uncritically. Another lesson concerned confirmation bias. Once investigators fix upon a suspect, they often interpret every fact through the lens of presumed guilt. Slater's pawn ticket, his planned voyage, his lifestyle, all were twisted into signs of murder, though none were. Doyle's pamphlet dissected this process, exposing how reasoning had been inverted. Modern discussions of wrongful conviction echo the same concern, showing the case's enduring relevance. Finally, the Slater affair resonated because it symbolized a clash between prejudice and fairness, between insider and outsider. It forced society to ask whether justice applied equally to foreigners, Jews, and those of disreputable life. Slater was an imperfect victim, but precisely for that reason, his exoneration mattered. It affirmed that justice is not a reward for virtue, but a right for all. Doyle's intervention, in turn, symbolized the role of the intellectual in public life. He demonstrated that writers and thinkers could influence real events, that words could shape institutions. His campaign was not only about freeing Slater, but about reminding society of its conscience. Part 9 then explores the cultural reception of the Slater case, its role in literature, Doyle's philosophy of justice, and the enduring legal lessons. It shows that the affair was not an isolated scandal, but a watershed moment that shaped how Britain thought about law, narrative, and fairness. Slater may have died in obscurity, but his case lived on as a touchstone. Doyle may have longed for literary immortality beyond Holmes, but in defending Slater, he ensured that his legacy would include not only fiction, but real justice. By now, the saga of Oscar Slater and Arthur Conan Doyle has shown itself to be both a story of its time and one that transcends its moment. To deepen the narrative even further, it is useful to situate the case alongside other miscarriages of justice worldwide, to see how Doyle's role fits into the tradition of public intellectuals as advocates, and to explore how modern culture, through literature, film, and legal studies, continues to revisit the lessons of the Slater affair. The Slater case was not unique. History is littered with examples of men and women condemned on scant evidence, prejudice, or error. Placing Slater alongside these cases shows both what was distinctive about his ordeal and what was universal. The most famous parallel of Doyle's time was, of course, the Dreyfus affair in France. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer, was convicted of treason on fabricated evidence in 1894. Like Slater, his conviction owed more to prejudice than to fact. Like Slater, he spent years imprisoned on Devil's Island in brutal isolation. And like Slater, his release came only after the intervention of intellectuals, most notably Émile Zola with his J'accuse. The Dreyfus affair convulsed France, splitting society into factions and exposing the rot within its institutions. While the Slater case did not shake Britain so profoundly, the parallel was clear. In both countries the law had been bent by bias, and only the courage of outsiders restored justice. Across the Atlantic, the Scottsboro Boys trial in the 1930s would echo similar themes. 9 African-American youths were convicted of raping 2 white women on weak and contradictory evidence in Alabama. Like Slater, they were condemned largely because of who they were rather than what they had done. Their case became a rallying cry for civil rights, just as Slater's became a symbol of judicial fallibility. Though separated by distance and context, the parallels underscore how prejudice repeatedly subverts justice across cultures. Even in modern times, DNA exonerations reveal patterns eerily similar to Slater's ordeal: false eyewitness testimony, prosecutorial zeal, institutional reluctance to admit error. The Innocence Project in the United States, which has freed hundreds of wrongfully convicted prisoners, could place Slater's story at the head of its casebook as an early prototype of the problem. His ordeal reminds us that wrongful conviction is not an aberration but a recurring danger wherever human bias intersects with law. Arthur Conan Doyle's intervention in the Slater case was not an isolated event but part of a pattern. Throughout his life, Doyle saw himself as a man of conscience with the duty to act. His defense of George Idalgi in 1907, wrongly convicted of animal mutilation, was his first major foray into legal advocacy. In that case, he applied Holmesian reasoning to demonstrate the implausibility of Idalgi's guilt, highlighting the absurdities of the prosecution's case. His success there emboldened him to act again for Slater. Doyle also campaigned on issues far beyond the courtroom. He argued for reforms in military equipment after the Boer War, exposing how poor quality boots and supplies endangered soldiers. He wrote about miscarriages of justice in the colonies. He even used his influence to advocate for humane treatment of prisoners of war. In each case, he deployed his pen as a weapon, using narrative and clarity to compel reform. This places Doyle in the tradition of the public intellectual long before the term was coined. Like Zola in France or later figures such as George Orwell in Britain, Doyle understood that writers bore responsibilities beyond art. Words could shape institutions, mobilize opinion, and demand accountability. His advocacy for Slater exemplifies this role. He was not content to entertain readers with Holmes. He sought to live out Holmes's ethos in reality. Yet his advocacy was also personal. Doyle saw himself as a man of honor, and cases of injustice offended his sense of fair play. He believed in the British Empire, in the law, and in order. For him, wrongful conviction was not merely an individual tragedy, but a stain on the honor of the nation. By freeing Slater, he believed he was cleansing Britain's reputation. This patriotic motivation gave his crusade added force, appealing to the public's sense of national pride as well as its sympathy. Though the case faded from popular memory after the mid-20th century, it has never disappeared entirely. Historians of law cite it regularly as a landmark in Scottish legal history. Scholars of detective fiction see it as a fascinating intersection of literature and life. And in recent years, writers like Margaret Fox have revived it for a new generation, exploring its drama and lessons. The case has inspired plays, documentaries, and academic studies. It is sometimes compared to modern wrongful conviction stories in media, such as Making a Murderer or Serial. Audiences continue to be riveted by narratives in which flawed institutions crush the individual, only for truth to emerge through persistence. The Slater case, with its cast of characters, the foreign outsider, the venerable detective writer, the prejudiced police, reads like a ready-made drama. Literary scholars also examine how the Slater affair influenced the cultural perception of Sherlock Holmes. The idea that Holmes's creator could himself act as detective blurred the line between fiction and reality in ways that fascinated contemporaries and still intrigue today. It suggests that literature not only reflects life but can shape it, training readers and writers alike in habits of thought that have real-world consequences. At its heart, the Slater case endures because it symbolizes something timeless, the need for vigilance in justice. Reminds us that institutions, however venerable, are run by fallible humans. It warns that prejudice can disguise itself as evidence, that haste can destroy fairness, that pride can resist correction. But it also offers hope that truth, though delayed, can be recovered, and that individuals armed with reason and courage can make a difference. For Doyle, this was perhaps the ultimate vindication of his life's philosophy. He had created Holmes to embody the power of logic. By defending Slater, he showed that logic could indeed save a life. He had argued that writers bore social responsibility. By intervening, he demonstrated what such responsibility looked like. Though he died disappointed by Slater's lack of gratitude, posterity remembers him not only as the creator of a detective, but as a detective himself in the highest sense, a seeker of truth in defense of the powerless. Part 10 broadens the lens to show Slater's case as part of a global pattern of wrongful conviction, situates Doyle among the great public advocates of history, and traces how the story continues to echo in modern culture. It demonstrates that the saga is not confined to Edwardian Glasgow, but belongs to the universal struggle for justice. Oscar Slater may have been freed nearly a century ago, but his case still speaks, reminding us that vigilance, reason, and conscience are eternal duties. The story of Oscar Slater and Arthur Conan Doyle not only illustrates the mechanics of injustice, but also invites reflection on the psychology that underpins wrongful conviction. Why do individuals, juries, and institutions cling so stubbornly to false beliefs? Why are errors so hard to correct, even when evidence points in another direction? To answer these questions, one must delve into the workings of human memory, bias and narrative, and see how Doyle's Holmesian logic offered an alternative model of thought long before psychology had the vocabulary to describe it. Modern research in psychology identifies several factors that commonly lead to wrongful convictions. Confirmation bias, suggestibility, overconfidence in memory, and the human need for closure all were present in Slater's ordeal. Confirmation bias played the central role. Once police decided Slater was guilty, they interpreted every piece of evidence to fit that assumption. His pawn ticket, his voyage, his reputation, each fact was twisted into proof. Contradictory details were ignored. This is precisely what Holmes had warned against. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Doyle, through Holmes, had articulated the very cognitive trap that destroyed Slater's life. Suggestibility was evident in the eyewitness testimony. Neighbors gave varying descriptions of the man seen near the Gilchrist home, but under police questioning, their uncertainty hardened into conviction. Modern studies show how easily memory can be reshaped by leading questions. A hesitant, "I think it might have been him," becomes, after repetition, "I am certain it was him." Juries, however, often overvalue such certainty, mistaking confidence for accuracy. In Slater's trial, this dynamic sealed his fate. The need for closure also explains much. The murder of Marion Gilchrist shocked Glasgow. The public demanded swift justice, and police felt pressure to deliver. Slater's arrest satisfied this demand, giving the appearance of resolution. Once closure was achieved, the system resisted reopening the wound. Appeals were denied not only to protect institutional pride, but to avoid unsettling the public narrative of crime solved and justice done. These psychological factors remain relevant today. They explain why wrongful convictions persist, even in an era of forensic science. DNA evidence may reveal truth, but human bias still drives initial errors and institutional resistance to correction. Slater's ordeal was an early case study in these dynamics, long before psychologists had formalized them. Doyle's intervention also highlights how the Holmes stories anticipated modern forensic thinking. Holmes insisted on impartial observation, the testing of hypotheses, and the separation of fact from assumption. These principles, though dramatized in fiction, foreshadowed later developments in scientific policing. In the Slater affair, Doyle applied Holmesian logic with striking effect. He examined the pawn ticket not as a symbol of guilt, but as a concrete object with a verifiable history. He scrutinized timelines, showing that Slater's voyage predated the murder. He dissected testimony, noting contradictions that undermined its reliability. Each step mirrored Holmes's method: gather data, compare, eliminate the impossible, and see what remains. What made Doyle's reasoning powerful was its humility. He did not claim supernatural intuition. He claimed only the discipline to observe without prejudice. This was, in essence, forensic reasoning before forensics became a formal science. In freeing Slater, Doyle demonstrated that Holmes's method was not merely entertaining, but genuinely useful, a way of thinking that could save lives. Another psychological dimension is the role of narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures. We prefer coherent stories to messy facts. Police and prosecutors, whether consciously or not, crafted a narrative of Slater as the foreign villain who preyed upon a vulnerable woman. The jury accepted it because it satisfied the need for coherence. Doyle countered with a rival narrative: the innocent outsider scapegoated by prejudice, the heroic defender exposing error. His pamphlet succeeded not only because it marshaled facts, but because it told a better story. The public could now see themselves in a tale of injustice corrected, rather than one of crime punished. This contest of narratives shows that truth alone is rarely enough. It must be embedded in a story that captures imagination. The lesson remains vital. In modern wrongful conviction cases, lawyers and advocates often frame appeals not just in technical terms, but as human stories of innocence lost, families torn apart, perseverance rewarded. Doyle intuitively grasped this need a century earlier. His gift as a storyteller was his greatest weapon. Today, the Slater case is often taught in Scottish law schools as a landmark in appellate history. It demonstrates the dangers of circumstantial evidence, the unreliability of eyewitnesses, and the necessity of review mechanisms. Students are encouraged to read Doyle's pamphlet as a model of clear legal reasoning written for a lay audience. It is unusual for a novelist's track to be studied in legal courses, but such is the power of Doyle's intervention. Beyond Scotland, the case is sometimes included in comparative law curricula as an example of how public opinion and celebrity advocacy can influence justice. It shows students that law does not exist in a vacuum, but is shaped by culture, media, and narrative. The Slater affair thus serves as a bridge between doctrinal study and the realities of human society. In detective fiction, the Slater case continues to resonate as a rare instance where the fictional ethos of the detective intersected with real life. Scholars note how later detective writers borrowed from Doyle's real-world crusade, portraying detectives not only as solvers of puzzles, but as defenders of the innocent against institutional error. Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, for example, often clashes with police who have leapt to the wrong conclusion, insisting on the primacy of facts over prejudice. The cultural memory of Slater's ordeal no doubt reinforced such themes. In popular culture, the case surfaces periodically in documentaries, articles, and adaptations. Its narrative appeal remains potent. The bludgeoned spinster, the scapegoated foreigner, the famous author stepping in as detective. It has the structure of a novel, yet it happened in reality. This makes it endlessly fascinating to audiences, a reminder that truth can be stranger than fiction. Perhaps the most enduring symbolic lesson of the Slater affair is that justice must extend even to the flawed. Slater was not a model citizen. He was a gambler, a womanizer, abrasive, even opportunistic after his release. Yet his imperfections make the case stronger, not weaker. If justice applies only to the virtuous, it is not justice at all. The true test of fairness is whether it protects the rights of those we dislike, those who seem suspicious, those whom society would rather cast aside. Doyle understood this principle, though he struggled with it emotionally. His disappointment in Slater's behavior after release shows how deeply he desired a storybook ending. But history rarely gives us saints. What it gave us instead was a flawed man whose life was saved by a flawed but determined advocate. Together they remind us that justice must embrace imperfection, for human beings are nothing if not imperfect. Part 11 explores the psychological underpinnings of wrongful conviction, the Holmesian method as proto-forensics, the role of narrative in shaping truth, and the afterlife of the Slater affair in education and culture. It emphasizes that the case is not only a historical episode, but a window into the workings of the human mind and the fragility of institutions. Oscar Slater's ordeal warns us of bias. Doyle's intervention inspires us with reason. Together, their story continues to teach, reminding future generations that justice must be defended not only in courts, but in hearts and minds. By the late 1920s, when the Slater case reached its climax, Arthur Conan Doyle himself was in the twilight of his life. The affair offered one of his last opportunities to play the public role of advocate, to apply his logic and authority in service of justice. Yet Doyle was also a man increasingly defined by contradiction, rationalist and spiritualist, knight of the establishment and critic of authority, creator of Sherlock Holmes, yet yearning to escape his detective's shadow. Part 12 explores these contradictions, situating the Slater case within the larger arc of Doyle's life and the fading of Victorian Values. One of the great ironies of Doyle's legacy is the stark divide between his reputation as the father of detective rationalism and his passionate embrace of spiritualism in his later years. To his admirers, Holmes embodied pure reason, observation, deduction, skepticism of superstition. Yet Doyle himself, after the trauma of the Great War and the death of his beloved son Kingsley, turned fervently to the world of seances, mediums, and the possibility of communication with the dead. Critics ridiculed him for this, noting the irony that the creator of Holmes could be taken in by frauds. Yet Doyle saw no contradiction. To him, spiritualism was another form of evidence, another way of discerning truth, albeit in realms beyond the physical. He argued that just as science demanded open-mindedness to new facts, so too did the search for spiritual realities. Where others saw credulity, he saw courage. The Slater case, however, placed Doyle firmly back in the realm of rationalism. His pamphlet and advocacy relied not on intuition or faith, but on Holmesian logic. He dissected evidence, exposed contradictions, and insisted on facts. It was as though, in fighting for Slater, Doyle briefly reconciled his two sides, the rationalist and the believer. He showed that while his heart sought solace in spiritualism, his mind remained sharp, committed to fairness in earthly matters. Doyle was born in the high Victorian age, raised in a world of empire, hierarchy, and moral duty. By the 1920s, that world was crumbling. The Great War had shattered faith in authority, exposed the brutality of modern life, and weakened the paternalist ideals Doyle cherished. The Slater case unfolded against this backdrop of disillusionment. For Doyle, defending Slater was a way of reaffirming Victorian values of fairness, honor, and duty, even as the modern world drifted from them. He saw himself as a gentleman, using his privilege to protect the powerless, embodying a code that was fading in the new age of mass politics and skepticism. The public responded with admiration, but also with a hint of nostalgia. Doyle's crusade seemed like a remnant of a bygone era when individual conscience could move mountains. Fox suggests that this is part of the poignancy of the affair. The Slater case was not only about one man's freedom, but about the survival of a moral vision. Doyle's intervention dramatized the persistence of Victorian ideals in an age that had begun to outgrow them. The case thus becomes a cultural marker, signaling the end of one epoch and the uncertain dawn of another. Another layer of complexity lies in the contrast between Sherlock Holmes and his creator. Holmes was the paragon of cold reason, detached, clinical, uninterested in human frailty, except as data. Doyle, by contrast, was emotional, idealistic, and deeply concerned with morality. Holmes solved puzzles. Doyle sought justice. In the Slater case, Doyle acted less like Holmes and more like Watson, the humane observer moved by conscience to intervene. Yet he used Holmesian tools to make his case. The paradox is striking. Doyle relied on the logic of a character he had invented, even as he infused it with a compassion that Holmes himself often lacked. This contrast explains both Doyle's success and his disillusionment. Holmes would have exposed the flaws in the case and moved on. Doyle, however, expected a moral resolution, gratitude, redemption, perhaps even transformation. When Slater failed to provide this, Doyle was disappointed. It was the difference between fiction and reality. Fiction allows for neat endings. Life rarely does. Doyle's expectations, shaped by his art, clashed with the messiness of human character. For Doyle, the Slater case was not just an external cause. It was also a mirror. It allowed him to play the role he had long aspired to, not merely a writer of detective stories, but a man of action, a champion of justice. He had often bristled at being pigeonholed as Holmes's creator. By defending Slater, he proved that he could live the part, that he could apply Holmes's logic in reality. The case thus satisfied his personal yearning for seriousness. At the same time, it exposed his limits. His disillusionment with Slater's behavior reminded him that life was not literature. His turn to spiritualism after the war revealed his longing for comfort beyond logic. His advocacy for Slater was his last great rational crusade, after which he increasingly sought solace in faith. In this sense, the case stands as a final act in the drama of Doyle's identity. The rationalist won last time, before yielding to the believer. The Slater case also reflects the wider decline of the British Empire's moral authority. Doyle believed passionately in the Empire, often defending its actions abroad. Yet, at home, the Slater affair showed that even Britain, proud of its justice system, could err catastrophically. This realization chipped away at the myth of British exceptionalism. If prejudice and injustice could thrive in Scotland, what of the colonies? What of subject peoples denied even the imperfect rights Slater had? For reformers, the case was evidence that Britain needed humility. Its law was not infallible, its courts not beyond reproach. This recognition was part of the broader process by which imperial confidence ebbed in the 20th century. The Slater affair, small in itself, contributed symbolically to the unraveling of unquestioned belief in authority. Part 12 places the Slater case within the contradictions of Doyle's life and the twilight of Victorian values. It shows how the affair reflected the duality of Doyle, rationalist and spiritualist, author and advocate, creator of Holmes, yet seeker of his own moral identity. It situates the case as a cultural marker of a fading age, when gentlemanly conscience could still sway nations, but only briefly, before modern skepticism took hold. The story thus becomes not only about crime and justice, but about transition between centuries, between values, between the worlds of fiction and reality. Doyle, in defending Slater, bridged these worlds one last time, leaving behind a legacy both inspiring and poignantly human. The Slater affair cannot be fully understood without returning to the city of Glasgow, the site where the murder of Marion Gilchrist occurred and where the machinery of suspicion and prejudice was set in motion. Glasgow in 1908 was more than a backdrop. It was a character in the drama, its tensions, anxieties, and divisions shaping the narrative of crime, trial, and conviction. To explore Glasgow and the symbolic figure of Gilchrist herself is to uncover the deeper social forces at work beneath the surface of the case. At the beginning of the 20th century, Glasgow was celebrated as the second city of the empire. Its shipyards launched vessels that powered global trade. Its factories churned out textiles, locomotives, and steel. Immense wealth was created, and the city's middle classes flourished in new neighbourhoods west of the Clyde. Yet alongside this prosperity lay crushing poverty. Vast swaths of the East End were overcrowded slums, with families crammed into one-room tenements, disease rampant, and child mortality shockingly high. The city was also a patchwork of identities. Irish immigrants had long been targets of prejudice. A growing Jewish population, many fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, settled in areas such as the Gorbals, carving out a precarious existence. Germans and other continental Europeans arrived as well, adding to the diversity and to the suspicion of outsiders. In such a climate, foreigners could easily be cast as threats, scapegoats for crime, unemployment, or social disorder. This mixture of wealth and want, respectability and squalor, bred insecurity. For the middle classes, respectability was both armor and obsession. To keep order, crime had to be punished swiftly and visibly. When Gilchrist was murdered in her West End flat, the event seemed to symbolize the breach of that respectability by the forces of disorder. The demand for justice was not merely about one life lost, but about defending the fragile sense of security in a city on edge. Marion Gilchrist herself was an unusual victim in some respects, but a symbolic one in others. A wealthy 82-year-old spinster, she lived alone with a maid, keeping to her routines in her well-furnished West Princes Street flat. She had inherited a fortune and filled her home with jewelry and art. In Edwardian Glasgow, she represented both the vulnerability and the respectability of the upper-middle-class woman, unmarried, wealthy, proper, and seemingly insulated from the dangers of the world by the solidity of her domestic space. Her murder in December 1908 shocked not only because it was violent, but because it occurred within that sanctuary. She was bludgeoned in her parlour, the very heart of her home, apparently in the course of robbery. The crime violated the Victorian ideal of the home as a fortress of morality and safety. To the public, it was an attack not just on an individual, but on the very values of domestic respectability. Fox underscores how Gilchrist's gender and age intensified the outrage. An elderly woman, defenseless and genteel, symbolized innocence. Her death demanded retribution with almost ritual force. The authorities could not leave such a crime unsolved. To do so would be to admit vulnerability at the core of Glasgow society. Slater's arrest thus satisfied more than the need to solve a crime. It reaffirmed the illusion that respectability could be protected by punishing the threatening outsider. The role of gender and class in the case is striking. Gilchrist's identity as a wealthy spinster made her a powerful symbol, while Slater's identity as a foreign, working-class man of dubious morals made him the perfect counter-symbol. The narrative wrote itself. The virtuous woman slain, the sinister outsider brought to justice. The binary of innocence and guilt mirrored Victorian anxieties about gender and class order. The maid who discovered Gilchrist's body, Helen Lambie, also figured prominently in testimony. As a servant, she occupied the ambiguous position between classes, intimately connected to her mistress's household, yet socially subordinate. Her testimony about what she saw and did not see was crucial, though riddled with uncertainty. But in the climate of the trial, her words were molded to fit the narrative of Slater's guilt rather than tested for accuracy. Class shaped not only the narrative, but the trial itself. The jury, drawn from respectable society, saw in Slater a man who offended their values by his very existence. He gambled, lived with a mistress, flaunted conventions. To them, he was already guilty of violating the moral order. Convicting him of murder was almost an extension of this moral judgment. The Glasgow police, too, were products of their city. Under pressure to solve a crime that had horrified the respectable classes, they fixated on the outsider. Their investigation was sloppy, riddled with errors, but it fulfilled the need for closure. Once Slater was identified, the machinery of justice closed around him. That his guilt was unproven mattered less than that his conviction reassured society. In this sense, the police acted less as detectives and more as guardians of social order. Their role was not only to catch criminals, but to protect the illusion of stability. Slater's arrest and conviction reassured the public that the system worked, that threats could be contained. Only years later, under Doyle's scrutiny, did the flaws in this process become clear. By dismantling the case against Slater, Doyle did more than expose errors. He challenged the very prejudices of Glasgow society, or he showed that Slater's conviction was less about evidence than about identity. He mocked the pawn ticket evidence, exposed the contradictions of witnesses, and highlighted the absurdity of treating a planned voyage as proof of guilt. In doing so, he forced the public to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had condemned a man not for what he had done, but for what he was. This critique extended implicitly to class and gender anxieties. Doyle did not diminish the tragedy of Gilchrist's murder, but he refused to allow her symbolic status to justify scapegoating. He insisted that justice must be based on facts, not on the emotional needs of society to find an easy culprit. In this way, the case became a critique, not only of police procedure, but of the social forces that had demanded a conviction at any cost. One irony of the case is that Marion Gilchrist herself fades into the background once the narrative shifts to Slater and Doyle. The victim becomes less a person than a symbol of respectability violated, of prejudice unleashed, of justice distorted. Her true story, her daily life, her personality, remains obscured by the role she played in the drama. Fox reminds us that behind every miscarriage of justice lies not only a wronged defendant, but also a forgotten victim, whose memory is reshaped by society's needs. In this sense, the case is doubly tragic. Slater lost decades of his life, and Gilchrist's life was reduced to a symbol in a morality play. Neither received full justice, he because he was wrongfully convicted, she because her real killer was never found. The story of justice undone is thus also a story of truth denied. Part 13 places the Slater case in its social context, exploring Glasgow's tensions, Gilchrist's symbolic role, and the interplay of gender, class, and prejudice. It shows how the city itself, with its prosperity and poverty, its anxieties about outsiders, and its obsession with respectability, shaped the miscarriage of justice. It reminds us that cases of wrongful conviction are never only about individuals, but about the societies that create the conditions for error. The murder of Marion Gilchrist remains unsolved. The man wrongfully punished for it, Oscar Slater, lived out his days embittered. The author who defended him, Arthur Conan Doyle, died soon after the victory. What endures is the lesson that justice must resist the temptations of prejudice, class anxiety, and the hunger for closure. Only then can it serve truth rather than illusion. The Slater case remains haunted by the unanswered question at its core. If Oscar Slater did not kill Marion Gilchrist, then who did? For all the energy spent in proving his innocence, the actual mystery of the crime has never been conclusively solved. This lingering uncertainty casts a shadow over the affair, reminding us that justice is not only about acquitting the innocent, but also about uncovering the guilty. The authorities in Glasgow were so quick to fasten upon Slater that they failed to follow leads that might have revealed the true killer. Over time, speculation has swirled, theories have been proposed, and names suggested, but none with certainty. The murder remains one of Scotland's unsolved mysteries, its void filled by rumour and conjecture. At the time of the crime, some contemporaries pointed to the maid's testimony as leaving gaps that might have implicated someone closer to the household. Helen Lambie had left the flat briefly to fetch a newspaper and returned to find Gilchrist bludgeoned. In those few minutes, an intruder entered and struck the fatal blows. But the possibility that the murderer had some prior knowledge of the household, that he was not a random thief but someone familiar, has never been excluded. Gilchrist's wealth and jewellery were well known, and whispers circulated that others might have had motives, resentment, financial grievance, or intimate knowledge of her routines. Yet these avenues were neglected once Slater became the suspect. The narrative of the foreign criminal overshadowed all alternative possibilities. Later, writers and investigators have proposed other suspects. Some suggested that the murder might have been committed by a local burglar, one of the many petty criminals who haunted Glasgow's streets. The West End was not immune to opportunistic crime, and Gilchrist's jewellery would have tempted any thief. But if it were a common burglar, why did the crime occur at precisely the moment when the maid had stepped out? Was it coincidence, or did the killer know her habits? Such questions remain unanswered. Others proposed that the crime might have been a personal attack, perhaps motivated by resentment or vengeance rather than robbery. Gilchrist was wealthy and independent, qualities that could provoke envy or hostility. Yet no evidence pointed clearly in this direction. The authorities, satisfied with Slater's conviction, never pursued such lines of inquiry seriously. The most tragic dimension of this uncertainty is that Gilchrist herself disappeared from view as a person. Her life was reduced to the circumstances of her death, her name to the shorthand for the case. She became the victim around whom the drama of Slater and Doyle revolved. Yet she had lived for more than 8 decades, accumulating wealth, creating a home, and managing her affairs. what she thought of her society, how she navigated the world as a single woman of means, what friendships and sorrows she carried, these are lost to us. The silencing of her individuality is another kind of injustice, collateral damage in the rush to convict an outsider, and in the later focus on Slater's plight. The unresolved nature of her murder compounds this injustice. She has never received the closure of knowing her killer was named. This lack of resolution shaped the legacy of the case in subtle ways. For Doyle, the focus was always on the wrongful conviction, not on solving the crime itself. He was less interested in identifying the real killer than in proving that Slater could not have been guilty. Holmes in fiction would never have rested until the true culprit was unmasked. But Doyle in life was pragmatic. Clearing Slater's name was enough. Chasing the phantom of an unknown killer was not his concern. Some critics later noted the irony. The creator of the world's most famous detective, in his most famous real case, left the mystery unsolved. Yet perhaps this reflects Doyle's priorities. His crusade was not about intellectual satisfaction, but about moral duty. Proving innocence mattered more than solving the puzzle. For historians, the open question of the killer serves as a reminder of the dangers of premature closure. The police, by fastening on Slater, foreclosed investigation into other leads. In doing so, they not only condemned an innocent man, but also allowed the real murderer to escape justice forever. This is the ultimate cost of wrongful conviction. Not only is one life destroyed by imprisonment, but another crime goes unpunished, another victim denied truth. Gilchrist's memory is bound to that absence, her death a symbol of both injustice and incompletion. The persistence of speculation also reflects the human need for narrative resolution. Readers of detective stories expect the mystery solved, the culprit revealed, the threads tied. Real life denies this comfort. The Slater affair ends not with a revelation of the killer, but with a void. This frustrates but also instructs. It teaches that the quest for justice must reckon with uncertainty, that truth is not always fully knowable, and that humility before the unknown is as necessary as courage in confronting the obvious. Doyle's pamphlet was powerful precisely because it admitted what the authorities would not, that the evidence did not prove guilt. To accept uncertainty was itself a moral act. In later years, criminologists and amateur sleuths revisited the case, proposing alternative scenarios. Some argued that a local thief named John Thompson, active at the time, might have been responsible, his modus operandi matching aspects of the crime. Others speculated about domestic acquaintances. None of these theories gained conclusive proof. The murder of Marion Gilchrist remains unsolved and perhaps unsolvable after so many decades. The trail is cold, the evidence too fragmentary, the witnesses long gone. All that remains is the awareness of what was lost, not only a life, but the truth about that life's violent end. This unresolved dimension makes the case unusually haunting. For Slater, the prison years could never be redeemed, even after freedom. For Doyle, the victory was bittersweet, shadowed by disillusionment. For Gilchrist, there was no resolution at all. She remains a cipher, remembered less as a person than as a symbol. The case reminds us that justice is not only about freeing the innocent, but also about honoring the dead. In failing to find her killer, society failed her as well, and yet in another sense her death reshaped the meaning of justice in Scotland and beyond. By becoming the focal point of a miscarriage of justice, Gilchrist's case forced reforms, highlighted prejudice, and exposed the frailty of institutions. Her murder, unsolved though it is, became the catalyst for a story that has continued to instruct for over a century. In that way, her tragedy was not entirely without consequence. It became a parable of vigilance, reminding future generations of what is at stake when evidence is twisted to fit prejudice and when haste replaces patience in the search for truth. The Slater affair thus closes not with clarity, but with shadows. The shadows belonged to Gilchrist's parlour, where a life was extinguished in violence. They belonged to Peterhead Prison, where an innocent man laboured for nearly 2 decades. They belonged to Doyle's conscience, proud of his victory, yet restless with disappointment. And they belonged to the unresolved mystery that lingers even now, the identity of the true killer, the missing piece of a story that will never be complete. In the decades after the appeal that freed Oscar Slater, the case slowly receded from public attention. At first, it remained vivid in the newspapers, a sensation that captured the imagination of readers who loved nothing more than the spectacle of crime, injustice, and redemption. But as years passed, the world moved on. New scandals replaced the old, wars reshaped society, and those who had been central to the drama faded from the stage. Slater lived his remaining years in air, embittered but free, while Doyle was remembered increasingly for Sherlock Holmes rather than for his public crusades. Marion Gilchrist's murder, still unsolved, slipped into the category of cold case, a footnote in Glasgow's history. Yet even as the story seemed to fade, it never disappeared completely. It lingered in memory, revived occasionally by journalists, lawyers, and historians, its outlines reshaped to suit the needs of each generation. For Scotland, the case became both an embarrassment and a lesson. Officials were reluctant to discuss it openly, for it revealed how fallible the system had been. Yet legal scholars found in it a compelling example for teaching about the dangers of prejudice and the necessity of appeals. In classrooms, law students studied the contradictions of the trial testimony and the illogic of the prosecution's reasoning. Professors cited Doyle's pamphlet as an example of how clear argument could cut through the fog of assumption. Thus, while the public at large forgot, the legal world kept the memory alive, turning scandal into instruction. For Glasgow itself, the case was remembered unevenly. Among older residents, especially those who had lived in the West End near Gilchrist's flat, whispers of the murder persisted, passing into local lore. Stories of the bludgeoned spinster circulated in parlours and pubs, mingling fact with rumour. Some retold the tale as a warning against trusting foreigners, others as a caution about hasty police work. The details blurred, but the name of Gilchrist carried with it a chill reminder of violence intruding into respectability. Meanwhile, in the Gorbals, where many Jewish immigrants had lived, the case was remembered differently, as a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice could condemn one of their own. Slater himself did not keep quiet after his release, though his voice carried little weight in a society eager to move on. He gave interviews, wrote letters, and even attempted to publish his own account of his ordeal. His tone was often strident, filled with resentment, and many readers found him unsympathetic. The contrast with Doyle's dignified narrative could not have been sharper. Where Doyle had presented the case as a moral parable of reason versus prejudice, Slater spoke in the voice of a man consumed by anger and mistrust. His bitterness alienated some supporters, but it also underscored the depth of his wounds. He had lost nearly 20 years, and no compensation could heal that. His very inability to let go of the grievance was proof of its enormity. By the mid-20th century, the case was largely forgotten outside of specialist circles. The Second World War consumed public attention, and in its aftermath a new Britain emerged with different anxieties and priorities. Yet in the quiet corners of archives, the documents remained: trial transcripts, pamphlets, newspaper clippings, letters from Slater and Doyle. Legal historians occasionally revisited them, fascinated by the intersection of literature, law, and prejudice. To these scholars, the case was not merely an oddity but a window into Edwardian society, revealing its fears and its failures. In the later 20th century, as interest in wrongful convictions grew, the case was rediscovered. Scholars began to place it alongside other famous miscarriages of justice, such as the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six in the 1970s, cases in which Irish men were wrongly convicted of terrorism during the Troubles. These modern scandals revived interest in past miscarriages, for they showed that the problem was not confined to one era. The Slater case was now seen as part of a continuum of judicial error, illustrating how prejudice, whether against Jews in 1909 or Irish Catholics in the 1970s, could distort justice in similar ways. Writers, too, found the story irresistible. It had all the elements of a thriller, a brutal crime, a foreign scapegoat, a famous detective writer stepping in to save the day. Yet, it also had the messy human dimensions that fiction often avoids. A victim reduced to a symbol, an accused man who was no hero, a savior disappointed by the very man he rescued. This combination of drama and complexity made the case attractive to journalists and authors alike. In the 1970s and 1980s, new studies revisited the case, drawing on archival material and reassessing Doyle's role. Some emphasized Doyle's brilliance, while others critiqued his paternalism or noted his disillusionment. The debate itself kept the story alive. By the early 21st century, the case had entered yet another phase of memory. In an era fascinated by true crime, where podcasts and documentaries dissect cold cases, the Slater affair found a natural audience. It was no longer just legal history, but popular history, retold for readers who craved the blend of mystery and morality. Margaret Fox's book belongs to this revival, presenting the story not merely as a curiosity, but as a parable of justice and narrative. Her account frames Doyle as both author and actor, weaving his literary fame into the fabric of the case. For modern readers, the appeal lies partly in this blending of worlds, fiction influencing reality, and reality echoing back into fiction. The afterlife of the case in Scottish memory thus reflects the shifting concerns of society. In the immediate aftermath, it was a scandal. In mid-century, a forgotten footnote. In the late 20th century, a lesson for legal reform. In the 21st, a story for the true crime age. Each generation found in it what it needed. For Edwardians, it was a tale of prejudice and miscarriage. For post-war Britain, it was a reminder that even the great Sherlock Holmes's creator could be drawn into the mess of reality. For our own time, it is a narrative of how stories shape justice, how literature and law are entwined. What is striking is how the case refuses to die. Though Gilchrist's murder remains unsolved, though Slater has been in his grave for decades, though Doyle himself has long since passed into literary immortality, the story endures. It endures because it is not only about them. It is about the perennial danger of injustice, the fragility of truth, the necessity of skepticism, and the strange ways in which imagination and reality intermingle. Doyle wrote detective fiction, but in defending Slater, he wrote himself into history as a detective of flesh and blood. Slater lived a flawed life, but in his wrongful conviction, he became a symbol of how prejudice can destroy. Gilchrist lost her life and her killer was never found, but her name endures as the victim whose death exposed the limits of Scottish justice. The memory of the case, therefore, is less about resolution than about warning. It tells us that justice is not automatic, that institutions can err, that prejudice is perennial. It tells us also that individuals can resist, that truth can be recovered, that stories can change minds. Each revival of the case, each retelling, serves to renew this lesson. Glasgow in 1908 may feel distant, but its shadows stretch into the present. The echoes of Gilchrist's parlour, of Slater's cell, of Doyle's study where he pored over transcripts, still sound in our debates about justice today. When the story of Oscar Slater's wrongful conviction reached its resolution in 1928, the reverberations did not remain confined to Scotland. Because Arthur Conan Doyle was already a global literary celebrity, the case carried symbolic power well beyond the borders of Britain. The creator of Sherlock Holmes was admired in Europe, America, and the colonies of the British Empire, and when he took up a cause, it became international news. The Slater affair therefore acquired an afterlife not only in Scottish memory, but in the wider world, where it was read as a parable of justice, celebrity, and the strange interplay of fiction and reality. In continental Europe, the parallels with the Dreyfus affair were immediately recognized. Newspapers in France, Germany, and Austria reminded readers that only 30 years earlier, Alfred Dreyfus had been condemned on flimsy evidence, in part because he was Jewish and unpopular with the military establishment. The Slater case seemed a Scottish echo of that French scandal, a Jewish outsider convicted on prejudice, an intellectual stepping in to defend him, a nation forced to confront its biases. Though the scale of the uproar was smaller, the symbolic pattern was striking, and European readers, still haunted by Dreyfus, saw in Slater another victim of the same old scourge of anti-Semitism disguised as justice. In Germany, where Slater had been born, the case was followed with a mixture of sympathy and unease. Sympathetic writers saw him as a son of their soil, unfairly persecuted abroad. Others, influenced by rising nationalist and anti-Semitic currents, dismissed him as a criminal who had merely exploited Doyle's fame to escape punishment. By the late 1920s, Germany was entering the turbulent years that would bring the Nazis to power, and the Slater affair was interpreted through that darkening lens. Some Jewish newspapers in Berlin and Vienna took up his story as a symbol of resilience, while right-wing voices used it as proof of supposed Jewish cunning. The polarization mirrored the larger divisions tearing Europe apart. In the United States, the case was reported with fascination. American readers had long consumed Sherlock Holmes stories with enthusiasm, and the idea that Doyle himself had turned detective was irresistible. The New York Times and other papers covered the appeal, casting Doyle as a hero who had exposed the failings of British justice. American culture, with its suspicion of rigid authority and its admiration for the crusading individual, found in Doyle's role an appealing narrative. The case also resonated with American debates about wrongful conviction, for in the same period the United States was grappling with its own scandals of justice gone wrong, particularly in cases involving immigrants and minorities. To American readers, the Slater affair was both a British curiosity and a mirror of their own struggles. Within the British Empire, the story had still other meanings. In India, South Africa, and Australia, newspapers reported the case, often with commentary about the fallibility of British justice. For colonial subjects who lived under laws imposed by distant rulers, the idea that even in Britain itself the courts could err so catastrophically was revealing. It undercut the claim that British law was the pinnacle of fairness. For some colonial readers, the Slater case was a reminder that the empire's boast of justice for all was more fragile than its rulers admitted. Doyle, though a patriot, had inadvertently given critics of empire a powerful example of British fallibility. Sherlock Holmes's international reputation amplified all of these readings. Holmes was already a global icon, translated into dozens of languages. His adventures read from Buenos Aires to Tokyo. When Doyle stepped into the real world as a defender of justice, the story seemed like Holmes come alive. In France, commentators wrote of Holmes avenging a Scottish Dreyfus. In America, cartoons depicted Doyle with a magnifying glass, inspecting the evidence of Slater's trial. In Germany, some readers joked bitterly that Holmes could solve mysteries abroad while their own courts sank into prejudice. The fictional detective had become a lens through which real justice was judged. This blending of fiction and reality also raised questions about the role of celebrity in justice. Would Slater have been freed if Doyle had not intervened? Would the press have cared? Would the courts have listened if an obscure pamphleteer, rather than the world's most famous detective writer, had written the critique? Probably not. Doyle's fame was his greatest weapon. It ensured his pamphlet was read, his arguments discussed, his campaign amplified. In this sense, the case foreshadowed the modern phenomenon of celebrity advocacy, where well-known figures lend their voices to legal or political causes. Just as Zola's fame had made j'accuse impossible to ignore, Doyle's renown made the Slater affair an international story. Yet celebrity also complicated the story. Because Doyle was Holmes's creator, the narrative often slipped into caricature, the great detective exposing bumbling police, the rational genius humiliating officialdom. This framing, while useful in attracting attention, risked oversimplifying the case. The real work of appeals involved lawyers, campaigners, and persistent supporters besides Doyle. But in the international imagination, Doyle was the central hero, Holmes reincarnated. This simplification ensured the story's endurance, but at the cost of nuance. The international echo of the case also ensured that Slater's name was never entirely forgotten. Even in his obscurity after release, his ordeal was remembered abroad as an emblem of wrongful conviction. For Jewish communities in Europe, his case was cited as an example of prejudice's dangers. For reformers in America, it was an argument for safeguards in law. For colonial subjects, it was proof that Britain was not as infallible as it claimed. In each place, the story took on the colours of local anxieties. Over time, as Doyle's literary fame continued to spread through adaptations, films and translations, the association of his name with the Slater case faded. Holmes survived. Slater became obscure. Yet when scholars and writers revived the story in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the international dimension resurfaced. Margaret Fox, writing for an American audience, emphasized the case's resonance with contemporary concerns about wrongful convictions. British historians stressed its importance for Scottish legal reform. Continental scholars drew parallels with Dreyfus. Each interpretation extended the story's reach, proving that even a parochial Glasgow murder could carry lessons for the world. Thus, the international reputation of Doyle and Holmes ensured that the Slater affair was never merely local. It was both a Scottish tragedy and a global parable. It showed how fiction could amplify reality, how celebrity could expose injustice, and how stories travel across borders, acquiring new meanings. In Glasgow, it was a tale of murder and prejudice. In Paris, it was a reminder of Dreyfus. In New York, it was proof of the individual versus the system. In India, it was a symbol of imperial fallibility. No single interpretation could contain it, because the story itself was about the fragility of justice, and that fragility is universal. The Slater affair might easily have remained a dusty entry in the annals of Scottish legal history, remembered only by specialists and gradually fading into obscurity. Yet one of the peculiar features of cases like this is how they are rediscovered and reimagined by later generations. Each revival reshapes the story, filtering it through new cultural concerns, new media, and new ways of telling. From newspaper serials to scholarly studies, from stage adaptations to modern documentaries, the Slater case has repeatedly been given fresh life, transformed into a parable that reflects the anxieties and fascinations of those who revisit it. In the first decades after Slater's release, interest was sustained largely by his own voice. He attempted to publish his memoirs, offering his perspective on the long ordeal. The book was less polished than Doyle's pamphlet, more raw and defensive, suffused with resentment against the authorities and even against Doyle himself, whose intervention he acknowledged but whose paternalism he resented. Readers at the time found the memoir bitter and unappealing, but in retrospect it provides a rare glimpse into the psychology of a man scarred by imprisonment. It also complicates the neat narrative that Doyle's account had created, forcing later interpreters to reckon with Slater not as a symbol but as a difficult, wounded human being. By the mid-20th century, as detective fiction entered a new golden age on screen and radio, occasional writers remembered the case as an anecdote, the real-life mystery that Holmes's creator had solved. Radio programs and magazine features retold the story in simplified form, emphasizing the drama of Doyle the gentleman detective rescuing an innocent man from the gallows. These retellings often omitted Gilchrist's individuality, Slater's flaws, or the full complexity of the legal battle, reducing the story to a morality play of genius versus prejudice. Yet, they kept the memory alive and ensured that the names of Doyle and Slater continued to circulate. In the later 20th century, with the rise of television documentaries and true crime journalism, the Slater affair found new audiences. British programmes devoted to miscarriages of justice revisited the case, placing it alongside notorious 20th century examples like the Guildford Four. Here the focus shifted from Doyle's heroism to the systemic failures of the legal system, the over-reliance on eyewitnesses, the closed nature of Scottish appeals, the influence of prejudice. Slater became one among many victims of institutional failure, his case a warning that echoed down the decades. Viewers of these documentaries discovered the story anew, often with a sense of outrage that such errors could occur in a society that prided itself on fairness. The academic world also played its part in reviving the story. Legal scholars published analyses in journals using the case to illustrate principles of evidence and bias. Historians of crime and literature examined Doyle's pamphlet as an unusual fusion of detective fiction and legal advocacy. Some explored the ways Doyle blurred his own identity with that of Holmes, presenting himself as the rational detective exposing official folly. Others examined the cultural reception of the case, how it reflected fears of immigration, anti-Semitism, and social change in Edwardian Glasgow. These scholarly treatments brought nuance back to a story that popular accounts had simplified, restoring the texture of the people and the society involved. In the 21st century, the story found a natural home in the burgeoning genre of true crime. Podcasts, long-form articles, and books presented the case to audiences hungry for narratives of injustice and mystery. The appeal was obvious: an unsolved murder, a wrongful conviction, a famous author turned detective. It combined the thrill of a whodunit with the moral weight of a legal scandal. Margaret Fox's book is part of this wave, retelling the story for readers accustomed to consuming crime narratives as both entertainment and moral inquiry. Her account weaves together the drama of Doyle's intervention, the tragedy of Slater's ordeal, and the unresolved question of Gilchrist's true killer, offering a version of the story that resonates with contemporary concerns about systemic bias and wrongful conviction. Modern adaptations also highlight aspects that earlier retellings neglected. Where mid-century accounts celebrated Doyle, contemporary versions often probe his limitations. They explore his disillusionment with Slater, his contradictions as rationalist and spiritualist, his reliance on celebrity power. They also restore attention to Gilchrist, reminding readers that at the center of the case was an elderly woman whose murder remains unsolved. In this way, the story has evolved from a tale of one man's rescue to a multi-layered exploration of prejudice, celebrity, victimhood, and the limits of justice. The true crime age also emphasizes the storytelling dimension of the case. Podcasts and documentaries dwell on atmosphere, the foggy streets of Glasgow, the claustrophobic courtrooms, the bleak cells of Peterhead. They dramatize witness contradictions, reconstruct the timeline, speculate on alternative suspects. In doing so, they mirror the structure of detective fiction, drawing audiences along with questions and cliffhangers. The irony is inescapable. The story of the creator of Holmes has itself been retold in the style of Holmes's adventures, as though life and literature were destined to intertwine endlessly. This afterlife in modern media ensures that the Slater affair continues to shape public understanding of justice. For audiences today, it is less about the specificities of Scottish law than about universal themes: how prejudice blinds, how institutions resist correction, how truth can be twisted into narrative. It fits neatly into contemporary debates about systemic racism, police misconduct, and wrongful convictions revealed by DNA. Slater's case may belong to 1909, but its patterns are recognizable in 21st century courts. What is most striking about these retellings is their persistence. More than a century after the crime, people still return to the story. It is not because the facts change, but because the story speaks to enduring human anxieties, the fear of being wrongly accused, the desire for heroes who defend the innocent, the unease that justice can be swayed by prejudice. Each generation reimagines the story in its own idiom, Victorian melodrama, mid-century cautionary tale, contemporary true crime, but the core remains the same. The Slater affair endures because it touches something permanent in human society, the tension between truth and narrative, justice and prejudice, fact and fiction. The persistence of the Slater affair in cultural memory, more than 100 years after the murder of Marion Gilchrist, demands reflection. Why does this particular story refuse to die when so many other crimes of the Edwardian era have faded into obscurity? Part of the answer lies in its sheer drama: a wealthy spinster murdered in her home, a foreign scapegoat condemned, a world-famous writer stepping into the role of detective. But beneath the drama lies something deeper. The story endures because it embodies tensions that never disappear, the fragility of justice, the seduction of narrative, and the way fiction and reality bleed into one another. The fragility of justice is the most obvious lesson. Every society likes to believe in the fairness of its legal system, but the Slater case reveals how easily justice can be derailed. It was not a single error that condemned Slater, but a cascade of them. Police eager for closure, witnesses pressured into certainty, prosecutors weaving prejudices into arguments, judges reluctant to challenge authority, jurors swayed by narrative rather than fact. Each step on its own might be explained away as human fallibility, but together they created a machine of injustice that nearly destroyed a man. This is why the case is still cited in legal studies. It demonstrates that wrongful conviction is rarely the result of one bad actor, but of systemic weaknesses. Reinforced by cultural biases, the seduction of narrative is another enduring theme. Humans crave stories with clear villains and victims, and the police provided one. The sinister foreign gambler who preyed upon a defenseless elderly woman. The jury accepted it because it was simple and satisfying. The press amplified it because it sold newspapers. Only Doyle was able to puncture that narrative by offering a rival story, the innocent scapegoat and the heroic defender exposing prejudice. In doing so, he replaced one narrative with another, proving that facts alone are not enough. What matters is how facts are arranged, framed, and told. The Slater case thus teaches that justice is not only about evidence, but about storytelling the way truth is, shaped and received by human minds. The blurring of fiction and reality gives the story its most unusual power. Doyle was not only a campaigner, he was the creator of Sherlock Holmes. This meant that everything he did was read through the lens of his fiction. When he dissected the contradictions of the trial, it was Holmes himself who seemed to speak. When he exposed the fallacies of the police, it was Holmes humiliating Inspector Lestrade once more. The world delighted in the spectacle of the detective come to life. Yet this delight also reveals how much people rely on fiction to make sense of reality. The Holmes stories had taught readers to value observation, logic, and skepticism. In the Slater case, those values proved genuinely useful. The line between art and life dissolved, and for once, literature changed the course of a real human destiny. This blending explains why the case refuses to die. It is not just a crime story, but a story about stories. Gilchrist's murder was framed as one narrative, Slater's trial as another, Doyle's pamphlet as yet another, and each revival since has layered on new interpretations. The case has become a palimpsest of narratives, each revealing more about the tellers than about the original crime. For Edwardians, it was about the fear of foreigners and the reassurance of authority. For Doyle, it was about duty and rationalism. For later reformers, it was about the fallibility of institutions. For modern readers, it is about prejudice, wrongful conviction, and the power of celebrity advocacy. The facts remain the same, but the meanings shift, and this constant reshaping keeps the story alive. Another reason for its persistence lies in its incompleteness. The true killer of Marion Gilchrist was never identified. This lack of resolution ensures that the case remains open in the imagination. It is like an unfinished novel, a story without a final chapter. Audiences return to it hoping for closure, for a revelation that will tie the threads. But the evidence is too cold, the witnesses long gone, the trail irretrievably lost. The void itself is compelling, for it invites speculation, theorizing, and retelling. Every generation of writers tries to fill it with a new theory, and in doing so they keep the story alive. At a deeper level, the Slater case persists because it raises timeless fears. Anyone can imagine being in Slater's position, arrested, accused, condemned, not because of what you did, but because of who you are, how you look, how you fit into the prejudices of your society. The fear of wrongful accusation is universal, one of the most primal anxieties in human life. To see Doyle's pamphlet succeed in piercing the fog offers not only outrage, but also hope, that reason and conscience can still prevail. This mixture of fear and hope is what gives the story its enduring emotional power. For Doyle himself, the case was a final vindication of his faith in reason, yet it also revealed the limits of reason. He freed Slater, but he could not solve Gilchrist's murder. He exposed the errors of the system, but he could not prevent prejudice from resurfacing in other cases. He restored one man's freedom, but he could not restore his lost years or heal his bitterness. This gap between what reason can achieve and what it cannot gives the story its poignancy. It is both a triumph and a tragedy, a reminder that justice is never perfect, only provisional, always in need of vigilance. As the decades passed, this duality gave the story a symbolic resonance that transcended its particulars. It became less about Gilchrist, Slater, or even Doyle, and more about the eternal struggle between truth and error, prejudice and fairness, narrative and fact. It became a mirror in which each generation sees its own anxieties reflected. In an age of empire, it was about Britain's moral authority. In an age of decolonization, it was about the fallibility of Western institutions. In an age of civil rights, it was about prejudice and minority vulnerability. In the age of DNA testing, it is about wrongful conviction and the need for reform. Each retelling recharges the story with fresh relevance. That is why the Slater affair is still told in classrooms, in podcasts, in books like Fox's. It has transcended its time to become a parable of justice and narrative, a story that resists closure and therefore cannot be forgotten. The murder of Marion Gilchrist remains unsolved, Oscar Slater remains an imperfect victim, Arthur Conan Doyle remains a contradictory hero, but together they form a drama that continues to echo. The case persists not because it is complete, but because it is incomplete, not because it resolves, but because it refuses to resolve, forcing us to return again and again to its shadows in search of meaning. The Slater affair, when pushed to its deepest level, becomes less a story of crime and more a meditation on truth itself. It forces us to ask what truth is, how it can be known, and why human beings are so often content with illusions in place of certainty. The murder of Marion Gilchrist remains unsolved. The innocence of Oscar Slater is established, but his full vindication incomplete. Arthur Conan Doyle's intervention revealed the limits of reason as much as its power. What remains after the noise of the trial, the appeal, and the campaigns is a philosophical puzzle. How do we live in a world where truth is fragile, fallible, and often elusive? The first lesson of the case is that truth is never self-evident. It must be constructed from fragments, testimony, objects, timelines, impressions. Each of these fragments is flawed, susceptible to error, distortion, or manipulation. Witnesses forget or embellish, police shape narratives to fit their needs, prosecutors turn ambiguity into certainty. The trial of Slater demonstrated this with painful clarity. Neighbors gave inconsistent descriptions, timelines shifted, the pawn ticket was invested with meaning it did not contain. Yet the jury, like most people, longed for a coherent story and accepted the flawed fragments as proof. This longing for coherence is at the heart of human cognition, but it is also the root of error. We would rather have a false certainty than endure uncertainty. The Slater affair warns us of the dangers of this preference. The second lesson is that truth is always mediated by culture. Slater was not convicted because of what the evidence said, but because of who he was in the eyes of Edwardian Glasgow. A foreigner, a Jew, a gambler, a man who lived outside the boundaries of respectability. His identity shaped how evidence was perceived. The same pawn ticket, had it belonged to a Scottish businessman, might have been dismissed as irrelevant. The same hurried departure, had it been a respected merchant's trip, might have been seen as unfortunate coincidence. But because it was Slater, each fact was bent toward guilt. The case demonstrates that truth is not merely about facts, but about the lenses through which society views those facts. Prejudice becomes part of the evidence itself, invisible but decisive. The third lesson is that truth requires courage. Doyle's pamphlet succeeded not only because it was logical, but because he dared to defy authority. He confronted the police, prosecutors, and judges, institutions that prided themselves on infallibility. He risked his reputation by defending a man whom most of society despised. Courage was needed not only to see the truth, but to speak it aloud. This too remains relevant today, for truth often requires the challenge of entrenched power, and power never yields easily. The Slater affair shows that reason without courage is impotent, but courage without reason is reckless. Both are needed together. Yet even with reason and courage, truth may remain incomplete. Doyle freed Slater, but could not reveal Gilchrist's killer. The real story of the murder remains hidden in the silence of time. This incompleteness is the most haunting element of the case, for it denies us the closure we crave. Detective fiction promises resolution. The culprit is unmasked, order restored, the truth illuminated. Real life offers no such guarantee. The Slater affair reminds us that truth is sometimes irretrievable. Evidence decays, witnesses die, memories fade, and the past becomes irrecoverable. To accept this is painful, but it is also honest. The story forces us to confront the limits of knowledge, to live with uncertainty without surrendering to false certainty. The fourth lesson is that truth, when uncovered, often disappoints. Slater was freed, but he was not the grateful, dignified victim Doyle had imagined. He was bitter, demanding, sometimes unlikable. Doyle's disillusionment reveals the gap between the abstract pursuit of justice and the messy reality of human character. We often expect truth to ennoble, to cleanse, to provide moral clarity. In reality, truth may reveal only imperfection and pain. Yet this disappointment is itself a truth worth accepting, that justice is not about creating heroes, but about protecting humans as they are, flawed and difficult. The fifth lesson is that truth is inseparable from narrative. Doyle won not because he discovered a hidden fact, but because he told a better story. He replaced the tale of the sinister foreign killer with the tale of the scapegoated outsider. Both stories drew on the same fragments of evidence, but one aligned with prejudice, while the other aligned with reason and fairness. This reveals something troubling. Truth alone is not persuasive. It must be clothed in narrative to be believed. Humans are creatures of story, and facts without story are inert. The Slater case thus forces us to confront the power of storytelling not only in literature but in law, politics, and daily life. All these lessons converge into one. Truth is fragile. It is vulnerable to bias, distortion, power, disappointment, and time. It can be uncovered but never possessed fully. The Slater affair demonstrates that even when truth emerges, it may do so only partially and imperfectly. Yet this fragility does not mean truth is unattainable. It means it must be pursued with humility, vigilance, and courage, recognizing that every conclusion is provisional and every narrative incomplete. For this reason, the Slater case endures as more than a historical curiosity. It has become a philosophical parable about the human condition. We long for certainty, but life offers only balance. We crave heroes and villains, but reality gives us flawed people. We seek closure, but the past often resists. The lesson is not despair but vigilance, to doubt easy narratives, to question prejudice, to accept uncertainty, to value the pursuit of truth even when it cannot be complete. Arthur Conan Doyle, in taking up Slater's cause, embodied this vigilance. He did not solve the murder, but he revealed the miscarriage. He did not restore justice fully, but he reduced injustice. His pamphlet is a testament to what one individual, armed with reason and conscience, can do. It is not perfection, but it is something. And in a world where truth is fragile, something is often the best we can achieve. This, finally, is why the Slater affair continues to matter. It is not because it offers resolution, but because it teaches us to live without resolution. It reminds us that truth is precious precisely because it is fragile, and that the defense of truth is an unending task. It tells us that justice is not a destination but a struggle, renewed in every generation. And it shows us that in the interplay of fact and fiction, reason and narrative, prejudice and courage, lies the endless, imperfect, but necessary pursuit of truth. As the story of the Slater affair draws toward its symbolic conclusion, it becomes necessary to bring together the three central figures whose lives were entangled by fate: Marion Gilchrist, Oscar Slater, and Arthur Conan Doyle. Each of them played a different role in the drama, and each of their stories ends in a different key. One in silence, one in bitterness, one in weary triumph. Yet together they form a composite picture of a society struggling with truth, prejudice, and justice, and of the human consequences of those struggles. Marion Gilchrist's life ended violently in her West Prince's Street flat on that winter evening in December 1908. She was 82 years old, wealthy and fiercely independent. She had lived her life according to the codes of respectability in Edwardian Glasgow, managing her fortune, employing her servants, and surrounding herself with the ornaments of domestic security. Her death shocked the city because it violated the sanctity of that world. Yet once she was murdered, she was transformed into a symbol. Her individuality faded. She became the spinster victim, her name shorthand for the case. The press, the courts, even Doyle himself rarely spoke of her beyond the circumstances of her murder. To history, she remains frozen in that parlor, her true self obscured. In this sense, she suffered a double injustice, the loss of her life and the loss of her story. The unanswered question of her killer compounds that injustice, ensuring that her memory is never complete. Oscar Slater's life was long but scarred. Born in Germany, he drifted through Europe and America, eventually settling in Scotland under a false name. He was a man of contradictions, flamboyant yet insecure, arrogant yet wounded, resourceful yet vulnerable. His trial revealed how quickly society could transform an outsider into a criminal in the public imagination. For nearly 2 decades, he endured the harshness of Peterhead Prison, locked away for a crime he did not commit. When he was freed, he was technically vindicated, but in reality he never escaped his ordeal. He received some compensation, but not enough to erase 20 years. He married, lived in Ayr, and tried to resume normal life, but bitterness clung to him. He distrusted others, quarreled with friends, and wrote letters demanding more justice. To some he seemed ungrateful. To others, he was simply a man too damaged to recover. When he died in 1948, his name was already fading. History has remembered him not for who he was, but for what was done to him. He became a symbol of wrongful conviction, more useful to society as a parable than as a man. Arthur Conan Doyle, meanwhile, ended his life as one of the most famous writers of his generation, but also as a man of contradictions. He had created Sherlock Holmes, the pure embodiment of logic, yet spent his last years devoted to spiritualism, convinced of life beyond the grave. He was knighted for his services to the empire, yet he also fought against its injustices at home and abroad. In the Slater case, he found one of his last great causes, a chance to embody the very values Holmes had taught the world: skepticism of assumptions, careful observation, rational deduction, and moral courage. His pamphlet was a masterpiece of reason, exposing the flaws of the prosecution and dismantling the case with clarity that still resonates today. He succeeded in freeing Slater, and in doing so he proved that stories can change lives. Yet he too was disappointed. Slater was not the grateful figure Doyle had hoped for, and the messiness of reality disheartened him. Still, his legacy in the case endures, for he demonstrated that even fiction can arm us for truth, and that one voice can matter against the weight of institutions. Together, these three figures illustrate different dimensions of justice and memory. Gilchrist represents the forgotten victim, her life overshadowed by her death, and her death overshadowed by the trial that followed. Slater represents the flawed victim of injustice, a man whose imperfection made him all the more vulnerable to prejudice and all the more troubling as a symbol once freed. Doyle represents the flawed savior, a man who could defend with brilliance but also expect too much, who could win freedom but not heal wounds, who could expose prejudice but not eradicate it. In their interaction we see the human complexity that lies beneath every parable of justice. The case also symbolizes the limits of human institutions. The Scottish courts, proud of their finality, were forced to admit error. The police, certain of their suspect, were shown to have blinded themselves with bias. The jury, eager for narrative, was revealed to have condemned a man on flimsy grounds. Even Doyle, the great defender, was shown to be unable to provide perfect resolution. The case thus reminds us that justice is not absolute but provisional, always vulnerable to error, always in need of scrutiny. It warns us never to accept authority unquestioningly, never to trust too readily in appearances, never to assume that narrative is truth. At the same time, the case offers hope. Slater was freed. The system, flawed though it was, eventually corrected itself under pressure. Doyle's pamphlet proved that words can have power, that reason can still sway hearts and institutions, that prejudice can be challenged. The lesson is not that justice always triumphs, but that it can be fought for, that vigilance matters, that courage is necessary. The story is both tragic and inspiring, reminding us that even when truth is incomplete, the pursuit of it is worthwhile. In the end, the Slater affair has outlived all its protagonists. Gilchrist lies buried, a killer unknown. Slater rests in a grave in air, his life remembered only in connection to the injustice he suffered. Doyle is immortal in literature, his name forever linked with Holmes, but also remembered for this real-life crusade. What endures beyond them is the story itself, retold and reinterpreted by each generation, serving as a mirror of society's concerns. It endures because it asks questions that never lose relevance. How do we know the truth? How do we protect the innocent? How do we resist prejudice? How do we accept uncertainty? The Slater case is thus more than history. It is a parable, a warning, and a lesson. It tells us that justice is fragile, that prejudice is persistent, that truth is elusive, but also that conscience and courage can make a difference. It tells us that fiction and reality are not so far apart, for the logic of Sherlock Holmes could save a man's life. And it tells us that even in failure, an unsolved murder, a bitterly freed man, a disappointed defender, there is meaning. For the struggle itself affirms the values of fairness and truth. When we look back on the affair today, we do not see a closed story but an open one, still resonant, still instructive. The shadows of Gilchrist's parlour, the iron gates of Peterhead, the study where Doyle wrote his pamphlet, all remain alive in imagination. They remind us that justice is never secure, that it must be defended again and again, that it lives not in institutions alone but in the courage of individuals who refuse to accept injustice. That is the ultimate legacy of the Slater affair. Not closure, but vigilance. Not perfection, but perseverance. Not certainty, but the unending pursuit of truth. More than a century has passed since the murder of Marion Gilchrist, yet the case still echoes. The killer was never found. Oscar Slater lived out his days in freedom, but never free of bitterness. Arthur Conan Doyle died soon after Slater's release, remembered both as the creator of Sherlock Holmes and as the writer who, in his final years, played detective in real life. None of them received the resolution they might have wished. The victim remained unsung, the accused unhealed, the defender disillusioned. And yet their story endures, retold in every generation, because it reveals truths larger than itself. The Slater affair is not just history. It is a reminder that justice is fragile, that prejudice can corrupt even the most trusted institutions, and that truth is always contested. It warns us of how easily narrative can replace evidence, how swiftly society can scapegoat the outsider, and how long it takes for reason to prevail. But it also affirms that conscience matters, that one voice armed with clarity can challenge power, and that vigilance is the price of fairness. Doyle could not solve Gilchrist's murder, nor erase Slater's suffering, but he proved that even fiction can inspire action. And that imagination, when wedded to courage, can change the course of real lives. The parlour in which Gilchrist fell, the stone walls of Peterhead Prison, the desk where Doyle composed his pamphlet, all have passed into history. What remains is the lesson that the pursuit of truth, though never complete, is always necessary. The Slater case ends not with certainty but with vigilance, not with closure but with a call to question, to doubt, to defend. It is in that unfinishedness that its power lies, reminding us across the years that justice must forever be guarded and that the struggle for truth is unending.